Parents canceled my birthday party to fund my golden sister's luxury trip. So I got even. Hey everyone, I'm Julia, and I'm about to turn 20. I'm deep in finals week right now, studying architecture. It's brutal, honestly. Late nights, tons of projects. My dorm room is a complete disaster with blueprints and coffee cups everywhere. But the thing keeping me going right now? My birthday is coming up, and my grandma's planning something for me. And yeah, I know. A family celebration shouldn't be that big of a deal, but for me, it's kind of a mixed bag. Growing up, family time always felt like a duty, like something I had to get through instead of something to enjoy. See, my older brother Ryan, he's 25. He's always been the favorite, the golden child, if you will. Meanwhile, I've been more of a side character in my own family, the extra, the one who just filled the space. I'll give you a good example. When I was 8, Ryan was turning 13. My parents went all out, like full-on event. They rented this place with one of those VR setups, a DJ, and a huge cake with his name written in bold. I remember being so excited. I mean, it was the kind of party you'd see in those over-the-top movies. And I thought, wow, maybe when my birthday comes around, they'll do something cool for me too. Well, my birthday comes a few months later. No VR, no DJ. Just a tiny cake from the supermarket with plain frosting and a pair of socks. Yeah, socks. I tried to act grateful, but honestly, it was a letdown. I remember my mom just patting me on the head saying, "Don't be dramatic, Julia, it's just a birthday." And that's when it kind of hit me. This was just how things were going to be. After that, it became pretty obvious that I was never going to be the one who got the big celebrations or the cool gifts. Ryan would get the latest tech every year. A new phone, the newest gaming console, you name it. While I got his old hand-me-downs. One year, when he graduated high school, my parents bought him a car. A freaking car. And when I graduated, they gave me a $50 gift card to a bookstore. Like, don't get me wrong, I like books, but it's not exactly the same level, you know? Honestly, I've come to expect it by now. It's like, whatever. I'm not going to pretend it doesn't sting, but I've just learned to deal with it. But the one person who's never treated me like an afterthought is my grandma Ruth. She's the real MVP in my life. She's always had my back, whether it's calling to check up on me or just showing up with a hot meal when I'm drowning in assignments. Grandma Ruth's different from my parents. She's been around forever. She used to run her own design firm back in the day, so she gets the whole work hard mindset. She was actually thrilled when I told her I wanted to study architecture. "You've got a good head on your shoulders, Julia," she'd say. "You'll go far." And the thing is, she meant it. No hidden agenda, no strings attached, just pure support. This year, she insisted on planning my birthday party. At first, I didn't really believe her. I mean, yeah, she's my grandma, and she loves me. But my parents have brushed off my birthdays for years. Why would this one be any different? But then she told me she had given my parents $3,000 for it. 3 grand. She wanted me to have something special for once, and she wasn't going to take no for an answer. When she told me, I was actually shocked. My parents never put that much effort into me, like, ever. So, knowing that my grandma was stepping up for me, it felt amazing. I was excited, but also kind of nervous, you know? I didn't want to get my hopes up, only for things to go the same way they always did. Anyway, fast forward to finals week. I'm cramming for my last exam, but all I can think about is going home and seeing if they actually pulled off a party for me. My roommate, Alice, even joked about it. "Hey, you ready for the big family bash?" she said, smirking as I stuffed my backpack with textbooks. "Yeah, should be interesting," I mumbled back, trying to sound more excited than I felt. The truth is, I had no idea what to expect. Alice knew my family situation, how it's always been this weird thing with me and Ryan. "Hey, at least your grandma's in charge, right?" she added. "She's always had your back." And she was right. Grandma's the only reason I even felt a glimmer of hope. If she was involved, maybe, just maybe, things would turn out differently this time. So the next day, I walked out of my final exam, feeling a huge weight lift off my shoulders. It was like the whole world was in color again. I started thinking about all the possibilities. Maybe there'd be decorations, balloons, a cake that wasn't from the clearance section. I was really letting myself believe, for once, that my family would actually do something nice for me. As I was heading back to my dorm, my phone buzzed with a few early birthday messages from friends. They knew I'd be heading home soon, and it felt good to be remembered, even if it was just by people I'd met a couple of years ago. It was weird. Like these friends who'd known me for such a short time seemed to care more than my own family sometimes. "Happy almost birthday, Julia," Alice called out as I walked into our room, grinning like she was more excited than I was. "Thanks," I replied, smiling back, but deep down I still had this knot in my stomach. Family stuff always messes with my head, you know? I wanted to believe things would be different, but there was this part of me that was bracing for the worst. Like, what if I get home and it's the same story as every other year? The bus ride home felt longer than ever. My mind was running through a million scenarios. Maybe they'd actually put up some decorations, or maybe they'd just left everything for me to do. I tried to keep my hopes up, telling myself that with Grandma Ruth backing this, it had to be good. It just had to. When I finally got off the bus, I stood outside my house for a second, taking a deep breath. It looked the same as it always did. No balloons, no banners. I figured maybe they'd set everything up inside, so I stayed positive. I opened the front door, calling out, "Mom, Dad, I'm home!" But all I got was silence. The house felt too quiet, like the kind of quiet you get when people don't want to be noticed. I felt this weird chill run down my spine. I dropped my backpack by the door and headed to the living room, my heart pounding a little faster with each step. When I turned the corner, I found my parents sitting on the couch, looking uncomfortable. That was when I started feeling like something was off. "Hey, where's all the, birthday stuff?" I asked, trying to sound casual. My mom and dad exchanged this look like they were bracing themselves for something. And that's when my heart really sank. But instead of freaking out right then, I just stood there, waiting for them to explain. I guess, in a way, I was still holding on to that tiny bit of hope that they'd actually done something for me. I'm standing there in the living room, my parents giving me these awkward looks, and it's like I already know what they're going to say before they even say it. I hate that feeling, when you can just tell something's wrong, but you have to wait for them to spit it out. My dad's the first to speak. He clears his throat, not really looking at me. "Julia, about the birthday party," he starts, and right then, my stomach drops. I felt this wave of dread, like I should have seen this coming. I mean, deep down, I knew. My parents never really cared about my birthday before, so why would this one be different, even with Grandma's money involved? But still, I'd let myself hope, and now I was standing here, waiting for the inevitable letdown. "We decided not to organize your birthday party," my dad finally says, as if he's delivering some kind of news about the weather, like it's no big deal. I blink at him, completely thrown off. "What? But Grandma gave you money for it," I say, trying to wrap my head around it. My mom jumps in before I can say more. "We gave the money to Ryan for his trip. He and his girlfriend flew to Vegas a couple of days ago." And that's when I feel like I've been punched in the gut. I just stare at them, my mind blank for a second as I try to process what they just said. Ryan? The money was for my birthday. It wasn't for some trip. You what?" I managed to get out, feeling this hot anger bubbling up. "But that money was for me. Grandma gave it to you for my birthday." My dad shrugs like it's nothing. "Ryan needed a break. You understand, don't you?" "Understand?" I feel my hands start to shake. "No, I don't understand," I say, my voice getting louder. "It was supposed to be my birthday party. I invited people and I thought—" I stopped myself, realizing I sound desperate. I hate that I still care, but I do. I hate that I let myself think they'd actually do something nice for me this time. My mom just sighs, like I'm being a nuisance. "We've already taken care of it, Julia," she says in this dismissive tone. "We called everyone and told them you were having some issues at college and that the party was canceled." I stand there, stunned. They lied to my friends. They made it sound like something was wrong with me instead of just admitting they gave away the money. "You lied to them about me," I say, feeling my voice crack. "How could you do this?" And then my dad's face changes. He's not avoiding eye contact anymore. Now he looks annoyed. "That's enough, Julia. You need to stop being so selfish. Ryan needed a vacation and you don't always get to have what you want." Selfish. They always use that word like it's some magic trick to shut me down. I almost laugh because it's just so ridiculous. "How am I being selfish?" I snap back. "It was my birthday, my party. I've been waiting for this for weeks." And just when I think this whole mess can't get worse, the front door opens and for a second, I hope it's Ryan back early, maybe feeling guilty. But no, it's Grandma Ruth. She steps inside, her eyes narrowing as she takes in the scene. She's wearing that no-nonsense look she gets when she knows something's up. I can tell she already knows it's bad. "What's going on here?" she asks, her voice sharp. "Where's the party?" I look at my parents, waiting to see how they'll try to spin this one. They both freeze, and I swear it's like their kids caught with their hands in the cookie jar. My dad opens his mouth, but no words come out. My mom just looks down at the floor. It's pathetic, really. So I decide to speak up. I'm done letting them control the narrative. "There is no party, Grandma," I say, my voice shaking. "They gave the money to Ryan so he could go to Vegas instead." The words spill out before I can stop them, and I feel this mix of anger and sadness, but also relief. I'm tired of pretending everything's okay. The look on Grandma Ruth's face is one I've never seen before. It's like this mix of fury and disappointment, and for once it's not aimed at me. She's staring right at my parents, and they can't even look her in the eye. Is this true? She demands, her voice sharp as a knife. My parents just stand there, silent, and that silence says everything. Grandma Ruth's face hardens, and she shakes her head slowly. I cannot believe this, she says, and I can hear the hurt in her voice. She turns to me, her expression softening. Julia, go pack your things. You're coming with me. I feel a weight lift off my shoulders. Without a word, I rush upstairs, grabbing my backpack and throwing in some clothes. I can still hear Grandma's voice downstairs, and she's not holding back. I can't make out everything she's saying, but it's clear she's furious. And honestly, it feels kind of good to know that someone's finally standing up for me. When I come back downstairs, my parents are still standing there, looking like they've been caught doing something shameful. They don't even try to stop me as I walk past them. Grandma's waiting by the door, and she gives me this nod, like we're in this together. We walk out, and I don't look back. As we get into her car and drive away, I feel this strange mix of emotions. On one hand, I'm angry, angrier than I've ever been. But on the other hand, I feel this sense of freedom, like I'm finally breaking away from this messed up dynamic. And yeah, I'm upset about the party, but honestly, it's not even about that anymore. It's about years of feeling like I don't matter. Grandma doesn't say much as she drives. She just reaches over and pats my hand, and for the first time in a long while, I feel like someone actually sees me, like someone actually cares about how I feel. Don't you worry, dear, she says, her voice gentle but firm. We'll sort this out. You deserve better than this. And the way she says it, it's not like some empty promise. It's like she means it. We pull into her driveway, and she turns to me with this determined look in her eyes. This might not be the party you were expecting, Julia, but we're going to celebrate your birthday properly. I manage a small smile, feeling a bit of hope creep in. Thanks, Grandma, I say. And it's the first time in forever that I actually feel like maybe things are going to be okay. As we step inside her house, I know things are going to change. I don't know exactly how, but for the first time, I'm ready for it. So after I move in with Grandma Ruth, it's a bit of an adjustment. I mean, I've always felt comfortable around her, but living with her, it's different. I'm used to keeping my head down at home, avoiding attention so I don't get caught up in whatever drama my parents or Ryan are creating. But here it's just me and her, and I've got no reason to hide. For once, I can just be me. Grandma didn't waste any time making sure I felt welcome. We spent the evening ordering takeout, like a ton of it, and she had this huge grin on her face the whole time, like she was just happy to have me around. She didn't even let me lift a finger, saying, "It's your birthday, Julia. You get to relax." It felt weird, in a good way. I couldn't remember the last time someone went out of their way for me like that. As we ate, she started sharing stories from when she was younger. I'd heard a few of them before, but hearing them again now, it felt different. Like she was trying to remind me that there's more to life than whatever mess my parents are caught up in. She told me about how she built her design firm from scratch, how she faced people doubting her just because she was a woman, and how she proved them all wrong. And honestly, it was inspiring. It made me think that maybe I could build something for myself too. But even with all that good energy, I couldn't shake this feeling that something wasn't right. The whole thing with my parents was still eating at me. Like, why couldn't they just care about me the same way they do about Ryan? Why was it always so easy for them to just push me aside? I didn't want to let it ruin my time with Grandma, but it was there, nagging at the back of my mind. Finally, after dinner, we were sitting on the couch, and I just couldn't hold it in anymore. Grandma, I started, trying to find the right words. Why don't they love me like they love Ryan? She paused, her hand on her teacup, and I could see this look cross her face, like she'd been waiting for me to ask. She sighed, setting the cup down and turning to face me. Julia, I've been wanting to have this conversation for a while. I just didn't know when would be the right time. Now my heart's pounding, and I'm thinking, what does that even mean? But I just nod, trying to keep it together, because something about her tone tells me that whatever she's about to say isn't going to be easy to hear. She takes a deep breath, and then she looks me straight in the eyes. Your parents, they didn't want another child after Ryan. I sit there, completely stunned. What? I manage to say, my voice barely above a whisper. But why? My mind is racing, trying to make sense of it all. She continues, and there's this sadness in her eyes. They thought Ryan was enough. They were happy with just him. And when they found out about you, they were upset. Your mom, she had a rough pregnancy with you, and the birth was complicated. She nearly didn't make it. I feel this lump in my throat, and I can feel tears welling up, but I don't want to cry in front of her. So, it's my fault then? I say, and I hate how small my voice sounds, but I can't help it. Grandma's face softens, and she reaches out, grabbing my hand. No, Julia, it's not your fault at all. These things happen sometimes, and it's nobody's fault. But after that, your mom, she couldn't bring herself to bond with you. And your dad, well, he just went along with whatever she felt. I sit there, trying to take it all in. It's like this puzzle I've been trying to figure out for years, and now all the pieces are finally falling into place. But it doesn't make it any easier to hear. So, they just decided I didn't matter? I ask, and there's this bitterness in my voice that I've never let myself feel before. But now, I just can't hold it back. Pretty much, Grandma says quietly. But I fought for you, Julia. I convinced them to keep you, and I've tried to be there for you as much as I can because I know how they've treated you. I'm so sorry you had to go through that. And that's when the tears finally come. I've always known something was off. But hearing it confirmed, hearing that my own parents didn't even want me, it's like this heavy weight drops on my chest. I've spent so much time blaming myself, thinking I just wasn't good enough for them to care. But knowing they never even tried, that stings. Grandma pulls me into a hug and I let myself cry into her shoulder. She doesn't say anything, just holds me. And for the first time, I feel like someone actually understands. She's always been there for me, and right now that's all I need. After a while, she pulls back and looks at me, wiping the tears off my face. Listen to me, Julia. None of this is your fault. You are a bright, talented young woman, and you deserve to be treated with love and respect. If your parents can't see that, it's their loss. I nod, sniffling, and she gives me this determined look. You're not alone in this. I've got your back, and from now on, we're going to make sure you have the support you need no matter what. I don't know what to say, so I just hug her again. It feels good to know that I have at least one person on my side, someone who really cares about me. Not just because they have to, but because they want to. After a while, we end up watching some TV, just trying to take our minds off everything. But my brain is still buzzing with everything she told me. I keep going over it, replaying the conversation in my head, and I realize that it all makes so much sense now. The way my parents treated me, the way they always put Ryan first. It wasn't something I did wrong. It was their choice, right from the beginning. Later, as I'm getting ready for bed, Grandma pops her head into the room. Hey, tomorrow, why don't we go shopping? Get out of the house and do something fun. We could even get some stuff for your room here. Make it feel more like home. I nod, feeling a small smile creep onto my face. Yeah, I'd like that. She gives me a warm smile back. Good. And remember, Julia, you're not alone anymore. We've got this. As she leaves the room, I finally feel like things are starting to change, even if it's just a little. For so long, I felt trapped in this cycle where I could never be good enough for my family. But now I know that it wasn't even about me. It was about them and their choices. And with Grandma's help, maybe I can finally start to move on and focus on building something for myself. I lie down, staring at the ceiling, and I feel this weird mix of emotions. There's still a lot of pain, but for the first time, there's also hope. It's small, but it's there. And that's enough for now. So after I move in with Grandma Ruth, it's a bit of an adjustment. I mean, I've always felt comfortable around her, but living with her, it's different. I'm used to keeping my head down at home, avoiding attention so I don't get caught up in whatever drama my parents or Ryan are creating. But here it's just me and her, and I've got no reason to hide. For once, I can just be me. Grandma didn't waste any time making sure I felt welcome. We spent the evening ordering takeout, like a ton of it, and she had this huge grin on her face the whole time, like she was just happy to have me around. She didn't even let me lift a finger, saying, "It's your birthday, Julia. You get to relax." It felt weird, in a good way. I couldn't remember the last time someone went out of their way for me like that. As we ate, she started sharing stories from when she was younger. I'd heard a few of them before, but hearing them again now, it felt different. Like she was trying to remind me that there's more to life than whatever mess my parents are caught up in. She told me about how she built her design firm from scratch, how she faced people doubting her just because she was a woman, and how she proved them all wrong. And honestly, it was inspiring. It made me think that maybe I could build something for myself too. But even with all that good energy, I couldn't shake this feeling that something wasn't right. The whole thing with my parents was still eating at me. Like, why couldn't they just care about me the same way they do about Ryan? Why was it always so easy for them to just push me aside? I didn't want to let it ruin my time with Grandma, but it was there, nagging at the back of my mind. Finally, after dinner, we were sitting on the couch, and I just couldn't hold it in anymore. "Grandma," I started, trying to find the right words. "Why don't they love me like they love Ryan?" She paused, her hand on her teacup, and I could see this look cross her face, like she'd been waiting for me to ask. She sighed, setting the cup down and turning to face me. Julia, I've been wanting to have this conversation for a while. I just didn't know when would be the right time. Now my heart's pounding, and I'm thinking, what does that even mean? But I just nod, trying to keep it together, because something about her tone tells me that whatever she's about to say isn't going to be easy to hear. She takes a deep breath, and then she looks me straight in the eyes. Your parents. They didn't want another child after Ryan. I sit there, completely stunned. What? I manage to say, my voice barely above a whisper. But why? My mind is racing, trying to make sense of it all. She continues, and there's this sadness in her eyes. They thought Ryan was enough. They were happy with just him. And when they found out about you, they were upset. Your mom, she had a rough pregnancy with you, and the birth was complicated. She nearly didn't make it. I feel this lump in my throat, and I can feel tears welling up, but I don't want to cry in front of her. So, it's my fault then? I say, and I hate how small my voice sounds, but I can't help it. Grandma's face softens, and she reaches out, grabbing my hand. No, Julia, it's not your fault at all. These things happen sometimes, and it's nobody's fault. But after that, your mom, she couldn't bring herself to bond with you. And your dad, well, he just went along with whatever she felt. I sit there, trying to take it all in. It's like this puzzle I've been trying to figure out for years, and now all the pieces are finally falling into place. But it doesn't make it any easier to hear. So, they just decided I didn't matter? I ask, and there's this bitterness in my voice that I've never let myself feel before. But now, I just can't hold it back. We go back to our routine, but I can tell something's brewing. I'm on edge, half expecting another call from my parents, but it doesn't come. Instead, the next day I get a text from Ryan that just says, "We need to talk. Meet me at the park." I almost ignore it, but something in me decides to go. Maybe I'm looking for some closure, or maybe I just want to hear him admit that they messed up. Either way, I show up at the park, my arms crossed and my guard up. Ryan's already there, sitting on a bench, and when he sees me, he gets up and walks over. "Julia, thanks for coming," he starts, like he's trying to be polite. "What do you want, Ryan?" I ask, not bothering with small talk. "I already told you I'm not coming back." He looks around, like he's trying to figure out the best way to start. "It's not about that. I need you to talk to Grandma." I raise an eyebrow. "Talk to her about what?" "She's cutting us off, Julia," he says, and there's this desperation in his eyes. "She said she's not giving us any more money unless we make things right with you. Mom and Dad are freaking out." I can't help it. I actually laugh. "Oh, now they're worried, now that the money's on the line." "It's not just about the money," he insists, but I can tell even he doesn't believe that. "She's changing her will, Julia. She's leaving everything to you." I feel my mouth drop open. "What? Why?" Ryan sighs, running a hand through his hair. "Because she thinks we've treated you unfairly. She said if we don't make things right, she's going to leave us with nothing." For a second, I don't even know what to say. I knew Grandma was upset, but I didn't think she'd go this far. And then it hits me. She's actually standing up for me in a way no one else ever has. "You think I'm going to convince her to change her mind?" I say, crossing my arms. "After everything you and Mom and Dad have done?" Ryan looks desperate. "Please, Julia. You know how much they rely on her help. If she cuts us off, we're screwed." I shake my head. "That's not my problem, Ryan. Maybe if you guys had treated me like family instead of a backup plan, things would be different." He steps closer, and there's this edge in his voice now. "You really want to do this, huh? You want to be the reason our family falls apart?" I take a deep breath, standing my ground. "No, Ryan. Our family fell apart a long time ago, and if you can't see that, then I'm not the one who needs to fix anything." He stares at me, like he's trying to figure out how to respond. Finally, he just shakes his head. "You're making a mistake, Julia. You're going to regret this." I turn away, feeling this sense of finality. "We'll see about that." As I walk away, I feel a mix of emotions: anger, sadness, but also this strange sense of freedom. For the first time, I said what I needed to say, and I didn't back down. It feels like a small victory, but it's mine. When I get back to Grandma's, she's in the kitchen, humming as she prepares lunch. I tell her about the meeting, and she just nods, like she expected it. "I'm proud of you, Julia," she says. "You stood up for yourself." And right then, I know I made the right choice. For the first time, I feel like I'm taking control of my own life, and I'm not going to let anyone take that away from me. It's been a couple of weeks since that whole showdown with Ryan, and I'd like to say things have calmed down, but that's just not how my family operates. After I walked away from him at the park, I felt pretty good, like I was finally standing up for myself, and making choices for my own life. But of course, my parents didn't take that lying down. I started getting calls from them the very next day. First, it was just my dad, trying to sound reasonable. Julia, we need to talk. I think there's been some misunderstandings. Misunderstandings? That's his go-to line whenever he's trying to play peacemaker without actually fixing anything. I ignored it, figuring he'd get the hint. Spoiler, he didn't. Then came the texts. My mom started with the guilt trip classics, saying stuff like, "You know, Julia, family is everything. We're all you have." Right, because nothing says family like taking money meant for my birthday and handing it to my brother for a vacation. I didn't respond. I wasn't about to get sucked back into their drama when I'd finally found a way out. But then the texts took a turn. They weren't just from my parents anymore. Now, they were coming from extended family. Aunts, uncles, even cousins I hadn't seen in years started messaging me. It was the same thing, over and over. "Why are you tearing the family apart?" Or "Grandma is old and being manipulated. You shouldn't take advantage of her." I couldn't believe it. They were all acting like I was the one causing the problem, like I had somehow tricked Grandma into giving me money or something. It was exhausting. And the worst part? None of them even bothered to ask how I was feeling. It was all about my parents and Ryan, as if their comfort and happiness were the only things that mattered. I showed Grandma the messages one evening, and she just shook her head, her lips tightening into a thin line. "They've always been like this," she said. "When someone steps out of line, they all rally to pull them back in." She gave me a reassuring look. "But you don't have to go back, Julia. You're allowed to set boundaries." Hearing that from her meant everything. For so long, I'd felt trapped in this cycle of trying to make my parents happy, thinking if I just did what they wanted, maybe they'd finally see me. But Grandma was right. It was time to focus on myself for a change. It was time to choose my own path. The next day, I blocked every number that had been blowing up my phone. If they wanted to drag me back into their mess, they'd have to do it without access to me. And honestly, once I hit block on that last number, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. With the family noise out of the way, I threw myself into my work. My summer architecture internship was kicking into high gear, and for the first time, I felt like I was exactly where I needed to be. The people there actually valued my input. Like, they genuinely listened to my ideas and respected my work. It was a total change from what I'd grown up with, and I loved every second of it. One afternoon, while I was going over some blueprints, my boss, Kevin, pulled me aside. "Julia, I've been really impressed with your designs," he said. "You've got a real eye for this. Have you ever thought about sticking around after the internship? Maybe taking on a part-time role while you finish your degree?" I was caught off guard. "Really? You'd want me to stay?" I asked, trying not to sound too eager. He nodded. "Absolutely. We could use someone like you on the team." It was a huge moment for me. I'd never had anyone recognize my work like that before. I'd always been Ryan's sister, or the quiet one. Never Julia, the person with her own talents and skills. I told Kevin I'd think about it, but honestly, I knew my answer right then. I was going to say yes. I was going to start building something for myself. That evening, I told Grandma about the offer, and she beamed. "That's my girl," she said, giving me a hug. "You're going to do great things, Julia. I've always known it." And that's when it really hit me. I was free. Free from the expectations my parents had placed on me, free from being stuck in Ryan's shadow, free to make choices that were right for me. It felt like I was finally taking the first step toward a life that was mine. But, of course, nothing is ever that simple. A few days later, as I'm packing up some designs to bring to work, there's a knock at Grandma's door. I freeze, because deep down I know who it is. When Grandma opens the door, sure enough, it's my mom and dad standing there, looking like they've been practicing their concerned parent faces. I'm not even surprised, but I feel this tightness in my chest. Grandma steps aside, letting them in, and I brace myself for whatever speech they've prepared. "Julia, we're worried about you," my mom starts, her voice all soft and sweet, like she's the concerned mother who cares. "You've been avoiding us, and we don't understand why." I fold my arms, leaning against the counter. "You know exactly why. You didn't care about me until Grandma got involved. You think I'm just going to forget everything?" My dad chimes in. "We didn't know you felt this way, Julia. If we had known—" "If you had known," I interrupt, feeling my anger rise. "You've always known. You just didn't care. Ryan was always your priority." They exchange glances, the kind they do when they're trying to figure out how to handle me. "That's not true," my mom says, but she doesn't sound convincing, not even to herself. "We've always loved you. We just didn't know how to show it." I shake my head, feeling a mix of anger and pity. "Well, you've had 20 years to figure it out and you didn't. And now, just because there's money involved, you want to act like everything's fine? My dad's expression changes. This isn't about money, Julia. It's about family. I almost laugh. Right. And when exactly did you start caring about family? Before they can say anything else, Grandma steps in. I think it's time you both left, she says, her voice firm. Julia has made her decision, and I support her. She doesn't owe you anything. My parents look stunned, like they didn't expect her to side with me so strongly. My mom's eyes well up, and she puts on this whole act. Please, Julia, we're trying here. But I've heard enough. You're only trying because Grandma cut you off. Don't pretend it's anything else. Grandma opens the door, and without another word, my parents leave, looking more defeated than I've ever seen them. And honestly, I don't feel sorry for them. They made their choices, and now they have to live with them. After they're gone, I turn to Grandma, and she pulls me into a hug. You did the right thing, Julia. Sometimes standing up for yourself means letting people go. As I pull away, I finally feel that sense of freedom again, like I've let go of something I've been carrying my whole life. Thanks, Grandma, I say, and I mean it. I don't know what I'd do without you. She smiles. You're stronger than you think, Julia, and you're going to build a life that's yours, no matter what anyone else says. And for the first time, I believe her.
Millionaire finds a small child on the street holding a baby, decides to take them home after discovering they were abandoned. The next day, the police showed up at his house. It was a cold night, one of those that seems to seep into your bones, even inside the comfort of the luxurious car that Richard Marlowe was driving. The city lights, usually bright and vibrant, appeared dimmed, reflecting Richard's somber mood. At 50 years old, he was a man who had reached what many would consider the pinnacle of success: wealth, power, and a grand mansion on the outskirts of the city. But despite all that, Richard couldn't shake the feeling of emptiness that had accompanied him for years. His life, entirely centered on his businesses, lacked something he couldn't quite define. That night, after an especially long day, he decided to take a different route home. It wasn't something he did often. Richard was a man of strict routines, someone who preferred control over surprises. Yet for some inexplicable reason, he turned right instead of going straight. The road he took led him to a part of the city he rarely visited, a dark and less traveled street where the opulence of his world had no place. The headlights of his car illuminated a scene that made him brake sharply. To the side of the sidewalk, under the dim glow of a street lamp, he saw a small figure huddled up. It was a child, barely visible through the faint light and the cold mist forming in the air. Next to him, wrapped in a worn blanket, was a baby. Richard froze for a moment, his eyes locked on the children, unable to process what he was seeing. This wasn't a scene he expected to encounter on his way home, and for a moment, he didn't know how to react. The child, who couldn't have been more than 6 years old, looked up when the car's headlights shone on him. There was something in his expression that made Richard feel a pang in his chest, a mix of fear and hope that seemed to pierce through the emotional armor he had built over the years. The boy said nothing, but his eyes spoke for him, showing a vulnerability Richard hadn't seen in a long time. Richard turned off the engine and hesitated for a moment. He wasn't used to getting involved in other people's problems, especially in something so far removed from his world of luxury and comfort. But that night was different. There was something about those children, a fragility and helplessness that resonated deep within him, touching a part of himself he thought had been lost. Finally, making an impulsive decision that went against his nature, Richard got out of the car and approached them. The cold was biting, and the silence of the night almost oppressive. He crouched down in front of the boy, trying not to seem intimidating. "Hello," he said, his voice softer than he expected. "Are you okay? Where are your parents?" The boy looked at him but didn't answer. His eyes were filled with an understandable distrust, mixed with a weariness that didn't belong to someone his age. Richard, not knowing what else to say, extended his hand. "You can come with me. You don't have to stay out here in the cold." To his surprise, the boy accepted without resistance. Slowly and cautiously he stood up, holding the baby carefully, and took Richard's hand. The boy's skin was ice cold, and his tattered, dirty clothes offered little protection against the cold. Richard felt a lump in his throat as he led them to his car. He knew he was making a decision that would change something in his life, though he couldn't foresee how much. The drive back to the mansion was silent. The children, exhausted, didn't ask questions, and Richard didn't know what to say. His thoughts kept shifting, trying to understand why he had done what he did, but finding no clear answer. What was he doing? Why had he felt the need to help these children? Those questions tormented him, yet at the same time he felt a strange peace, as if he had done something he instinctively knew was right. When they arrived at the mansion, Richard was greeted by Mrs. Thompson, his housekeeper, an older woman who had worked for him for years and knew his reserved character well. The surprise on her face at seeing the children was evident, but her professionalism kept her from asking questions. She simply led them inside, where she prepared a hot bath and some food. Richard watched in silence, still processing what he had done. There was something about those children that disturbed him, something he couldn't fully comprehend, but that kept him alert and worried. After the children were settled in one of the guest rooms, Richard remained alone in the living room, lost in thought. The house, which had always been a refuge of silence and solitude, felt different that night. He couldn't sleep. His mind kept returning to what he had seen on the street, to the boy's gaze and the weight of the decision he had made. He knew this wasn't something temporary, that by bringing those children into his home, he had taken on a responsibility he couldn't simply ignore. At that moment, for the first time in years, Richard felt that his life was about to change in an irrevocable way. The walls he had built around his heart were beginning to crack, and though he didn't fully understand it yet, he knew that those children had come into his life for a reason that time would reveal. And so, as the mansion slept, Richard remained in the darkness of his living room, contemplating the beginning of what would become the most important journey of his life. Dawn slowly crept into the Marlowe mansion, painting the walls with a soft golden light. Richard, however, hadn't been able to sleep. He had spent the night in the living room, restless, with thoughts swirling that gave him no rest. His life, which until that moment had been so controlled, so predictable, now seemed to be thrown into emotional chaos that he didn't know how to handle. There was something about those children, something that awakened emotions in him that he had buried long ago. As he rose from the sofa and walked upstairs, the silence of the house felt overwhelming. He had decided to bring those children into his home, but he had no idea how to proceed from there. He, a man accustomed to solving complex problems in the business world, found himself lost in the simple task of caring for two small children. As he approached the door of the guest room, he heard a soft murmur, almost a whisper. He carefully opened the door and saw Tommy, the 6-year-old, sitting on the bed next to the baby. Although it was barely dawn, Tommy was already awake, looking at the baby with a tenderness and concern that moved Richard. It seemed that, despite his young age, Tommy had assumed the role of protector, as if he understood that his little brother depended entirely on him. Richard stood in the doorway, watching silently. There was something in the way Tommy cared for the baby that seemed familiar, as if he were seeing a reflection of himself, though in a much younger and more innocent version. He remembered his own childhood, a time he had buried under layers of success and wealth, but that now, seeing Tommy, resurfaced with unexpected intensity. The sound of light footsteps pulled him out of his thoughts. Mrs. Thompson, always punctual and efficient, was approaching down the hallway, carrying a tray with breakfast. Seeing Richard at the door, her expression shifted to a mix of surprise and concern. She knew her boss well enough to realize that this wasn't something he had planned, and that the situation affected him more than he was willing to admit. "Good morning, Mr. Marlowe," she said softly, so as not to wake the baby who had fallen asleep in Tommy's arms. "I've prepared some breakfast for the children. Would you like to come to the dining room?" Richard nodded, still looking at Tommy. "Thank you, Mrs. Thompson, although I'm not sure if the children are ready to leave the room." Mrs. Thompson smiled kindly. "Don't worry, sir. Children are stronger than they seem. They just need a little time to adjust. If you allow me, I can help Tommy carry the baby to the dining room." Richard stepped back, allowing Mrs. Thompson to enter the room. He watched as, with infinite patience and a natural gentleness, She helped Tommy get up from the bed and guided him toward the dining room, carefully holding the baby. Despite his usual emotional distance, Richard felt a pang of gratitude toward his housekeeper. He knew that without her, he would be completely lost in this situation. Breakfast passed in a strange but not uncomfortable silence. Tommy ate quietly, casting furtive glances at Richard, as if trying to figure out what kind of person he was. Richard, on his part, observed him with a mix of curiosity and confusion. There was something about the boy that intrigued him, something beyond the obvious vulnerability. Tommy was reserved, but his eyes spoke of a life experience that didn't match his age. After breakfast, Richard felt the need to do something, anything, to better understand the children now under his roof. He decided that the best way to start would be to talk to Tommy, try to learn more about his situation. However, when he approached the boy and asked about his family, about how he had ended up on that street the previous night, Tommy immediately shut down. He lowered his gaze, avoiding eye contact, and merely shrugged. Richard didn't press further. He could see that the boy was battling something, a burden he wasn't ready to share. The frustration of not being able to help him gnawed at Richard, but he also understood that he couldn't force the situation. He would have to earn Tommy's trust, and that would require time and patience, two things Richard wasn't accustomed to dealing with in his daily life. Throughout the day, Richard continued to observe Tommy, searching for signs, some clue that might give him an idea of how to act. The boy was surprisingly self-sufficient for his age, something that worried and amazed Richard in equal measure. Instead of playing or seeking attention, Tommy focused solely on caring for the baby. He changed the baby's diapers with a skill that clearly showed it wasn't his first time, and he fed the baby with the bottle Mrs. Thompson had prepared, without showing any signs of impatience or fatigue. That night, after ensuring the children were comfortable and well taken care of, Richard retreated to his study. The house was quiet, but his mind was far from calm. The unanswered questions piled up, and the feeling that there was something more, something he didn't fully understand yet, kept him on edge. He sat at his desk and opened a bottle of whiskey, his usual way of calming down after a difficult day. However, this time, the liquor didn't offer the comfort he expected. He stared at the glass, twirling it between his fingers, and suddenly, the thought of the children sleeping under his roof overwhelmed him with an unexpected force. What would he do with them? What role would they play in his life from now on? He knew he couldn't just let them go, not after what he had seen in their eyes. Finally, after a long night of reflection, Richard made a decision. He didn't know how or why, but he was determined to care for those children. There was something about them that made him feel responsible, something that awakened in him a protective instinct he didn't know he had. It would be difficult, he knew, but he also understood that this was something he had to do, not just for the children, but also for himself. With that resolve, Richard went to bed, knowing that, although the road ahead would be challenging, he was ready to face it. He didn't have all the answers, but for the first time in years, he felt he was doing something meaningful, something that truly mattered. As he drifted into sleep, the image of Tommy caring for the baby came to mind, and he knew this was just the beginning of a profound change in his life. The next morning began with an unusual stillness in the Marlowe mansion. Richard, who had slept little and poorly, woke up with a sense of unease he couldn't fully explain. As he descended the stairs, he was greeted by the aroma of the breakfast Mrs. Thompson had prepared, but the atmosphere in the house felt heavy, laden with an invisible tension. Tommy was sitting at the table, feeding the baby with the same skill he had shown the day before. Richard watched them for a moment from the dining room door, feeling a mix of admiration and concern. He knew he needed to find a way to get to the bottom of the children's story, but he didn't want to pressure Tommy, not until he had earned more of his trust. However, the morning's silence was abruptly interrupted by a loud knock at the front door. Mrs. Thompson, who was serving breakfast, froze, her eyes meeting Richard's, reflecting the same surprise and concern. Richard felt a chill run down his spine as he walked toward the door. When he opened it, he found himself face to face with several police officers. Standing in front was a middle-aged man with a stern expression and a posture that radiated authority. Beside him, a young woman with sharp eyes observed him with curiosity. The man stepped forward and spoke in a firm voice. "Mr. Marlowe, I'm Detective John Harris, and this is my partner, Detective Sarah Carter. We're here because of a report received last night about the possible abduction of 2 children. We were informed that a man was seen taking a small child and a baby from a street in the city center. We need to ask you some questions." Richard was momentarily speechless, processing the situation. The word abduction echoed in his mind like a hammer. He was aware that he had made an impulsive decision by bringing those children to his home, but he never imagined anyone would accuse him of something so serious. His first instinct was to be outraged, but he quickly realized that showing anger would only make things worse. "Detective Harris," Richard began, striving to remain calm, "I believe there's been a misunderstanding. I found those children on the street last night, abandoned and in danger. I just wanted to help them." Sarah Carter, who had remained silent until then, stepped forward. "We understand your concern, Mr. Marlowe, but we need to verify the facts. May we see the children?" Richard nodded, his mind working frantically to find the best way to handle the situation. He knew the police weren't there to listen to his version of events. They were there to ensure the children were safe. Mrs. Thompson, who had been watching from a distance, stepped in. "Sir, if I may, I'll take the detectives to the children. They're fine, I assure you. Mr. Marlowe only tried to do the right thing." Harris looked at her with an inscrutable expression before nodding. "Take us to them, please." As Mrs. Thompson led the detectives toward the dining room, Richard followed closely, feeling a mix of nervousness and helplessness. He knew things could quickly turn against him if he didn't manage to prove that he had acted with good intentions. Entering the dining room, he found Tommy and the baby just as he had left them. The baby was in the high chair playing with a spoon, while Tommy watched with a protective expression. Tommy looked up when the detectives entered, and Richard noticed a flicker of fear in his eyes. The boy didn't move, but he visibly tensed as if bracing for the worst. Richard felt a pang of pain in his chest as he realized that despite Tommy's apparent calm, the boy was terrified of what might happen. "This is Tommy and the baby. I'm not sure of his name," Richard explained, feeling Harris's scrutinizing gaze on him. "I found them last night, huddled on the street. I don't know anything more about them, only that they were in a dangerous situation." Sarah approached Tommy, kneeling down to be at his level. "Hello, Tommy," she said softly, trying not to frighten him. "What's your name? And what's your little brother's name?" Tommy looked at Sarah with distrust but didn't answer. He simply pressed his lips together and turned his gaze toward the baby. The gesture was so eloquent that no words were needed. Sarah exchanged a glance with Harris, who nodded slightly. "We understand that you're scared, Tommy," Sarah continued patiently. "We just want to make sure you and your brother are okay. Can you tell us anything about what happened?" Tommy's silence was an answer in itself. Richard felt a cold sweat on the back of his neck. He knew that the boy's silence could be interpreted as a sign that something was wrong. The detectives seemed to think the same, and the tension in the room grew. Finally, Mrs. Thompson broke the silence. "Detective Harris, Detective Carter, I was the one who helped Mr. Marlowe bring these children inside. I can assure you that he only tried to protect them. I saw with my own eyes how they were when he found them. They had no one. They were alone and scared." Harris looked at Mrs. Thompson, evaluating the situation. "We don't doubt what you're saying, Mrs. Thompson," he finally said, though his tone wasn't entirely convincing. "But we need to do our job. The children will need to remain under care while we investigate further." Richard felt a momentary relief, but it was short-lived. He knew this was far from over. The detectives had made it clear that their presence at the mansion wasn't just to ensure the children's safety, but also to uncover if there was something more to the story that Richard wasn't telling. "Could the children stay here while you investigate?" Richard asked, trying to maintain his composure. "I don't want them to go through any more stress." Harris considered this for a moment before responding. "For now, yes, but you must understand this isn't a final resolution. We will continue investigating." Sarah stood up and looked at Richard with an expression that was difficult to read. "Mr. Marlowe, this is an unusual case. We appreciate your cooperation, but there are still many unanswered questions. We'll be in touch." Richard nodded, knowing that his life, already disrupted by the arrival of the children, was about to become even more complicated. The police weren't going to let this go, and every move he made would be watched and scrutinized. As the detectives left, Richard stood at the door watching as the police cars drove down the long driveway. He felt a knot in his stomach. He had done what he believed was right, but now he was trapped in a situation that could spiral out of control at any moment. Returning inside, he found Tommy sitting in the same spot, watching the baby. Richard approached and sat down beside him, feeling an urgent need to connect with the boy, to make him understand that he was there to help. "I won't let them hurt you," he said quietly, more to himself than to Tommy. "We'll find a way through this, I promise." Tommy didn't respond, but the tension in his shoulders seemed to ease slightly. Richard knew in that moment that the promise he had just made wasn't only for Tommy, but also for himself. And somehow, he would have to find a way to keep it, no matter how difficult the road ahead might be. The following days at the Marlowe mansion were marked by a heavy and uncertain atmosphere. Richard tried to maintain a facade of calm, but inside his mind was in constant turmoil. The almost daily presence of Detectives Harris and Sarah Carter only heightened his anxiety. He knew his life was under constant scrutiny, and every question they asked, every detail they investigated, brought them closer to a truth he would rather keep hidden. Tommy, for his part, remained as reserved as ever. Although Richard tried to get closer to the boy, his efforts seemed to bounce off an invisible barrier. Tommy didn't say much, but he observed everything around him with keen eyes, as if constantly evaluating his surroundings and the people around him. Richard was beginning to realize that, despite his young age, Tommy had experienced things that had forced him to grow up faster than normal. One afternoon, while Richard was working in his study, Sarah knocked on the door. He had seen her several times over the past few days, but this time he noticed something different in her expression. There was a mix of determination and compassion that put him on alert. "Mr. Marlowe, may we talk?" Sarah asked, entering the study with a folder under her arm. Richard nodded and leaned forward, preparing for whatever she was about to reveal. Sarah sat down in front of him, and after a brief silence, she opened the folder and pulled out some documents. "We've been investigating the children's past, but we've also reviewed your history, Mr. Marlowe," Sarah began, her voice firm but not accusatory. "And we've found something I believe you need to know." Richard felt a knot in his stomach. He knew this moment would come sooner or later, but he wasn't prepared to face it. "What did you find?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady. "Years ago, you were involved in a fierce business competition with a man named Victor Hargrove," Sarah continued, wasting no time. "We know that competition ended disastrously for him. Hargrove lost everything: his company, his fortune, and his family. He disappeared off the radar after that, and we've discovered that he spent some time abroad before secretly returning to the country." Richard closed his eyes for a moment, letting the name resonate in his mind. Hargrove. It was a name he hadn't spoken in years, but one that had left an indelible mark on his life. The competition with Hargrove had been brutal. Richard had used every trick in the book to destroy his rival and secure his own success. At the time, he hadn't stopped to think about the personal consequences for Hargrove, but now, all of it was coming back to him with unsettling clarity. "Are you suggesting these children are connected to Hargrove?" Richard asked, opening his eyes and fixing them on Sarah. "We can't say for certain, but there are too many coincidences to ignore," Sarah replied. "Hargrove didn't disappear completely, Mr. Marlowe. He reinvented himself under a false name, and according to our investigations, he's been watching your movements for years, waiting for the right moment to—" Sarah paused, choosing her words carefully. Richard looked at her intently, understanding what she was implying. "To get revenge," he finished. Sarah nodded slowly. "It's a possibility we can't rule out. The children could be part of that plan." The impact of those words hit Richard like a ton of bricks. He stood up from his chair and began pacing the study, trying to process the magnitude of what he had just discovered. Hargrove, a man he had mercilessly destroyed, had returned to make him pay the price. And now those children, whom Richard had begun to see as his responsibility, were caught in the middle of a revenge scheme that should never have happened. "What are you going to do about it?" he finally asked, stopping to look at Sarah. "We're delving deeper into Hargrove's life, trying to track every move he's made since he returned to the country," she replied. "But the most troubling thing is that Hargrove seems to have vanished again, just as we were closing in on the truth. This leads us to believe that he's on the move and his next target could be you." Richard felt a surge of anger mixed with fear. He couldn't allow Hargrove to harm those children or anyone else. He had spent too long ignoring the consequences of his actions, but now reality had caught up with him in the most brutal way possible. "Tommy knows something," Richard said, more to himself than to Sarah. "I see it in his eyes. He's keeping a secret, and I think it has to do with Hargrove." Sarah nodded, but her expression grew serious. "That's likely, but we can't push him too hard. The boy has already been through so much. We need his trust to get to the truth, not his fear." Richard knew she was right, but he also knew that time wasn't on their side. If Hargrove was really behind all this, he could make his move at any moment. Richard needed to protect those children, and to do that he would have to uncover the truth, no matter how painful it was. That night, as he walked through the mansion's hallways, Richard felt as if a dark shadow was following him. Memories of his competition with Hargrove haunted him, mingling with images of Tommy and the baby. He had been ruthless, relentless in his pursuit of success, but now those actions from the past had come back to torment him. He stopped in front of the door to the room where the children were sleeping. He opened the door carefully and saw Tommy awake, curled up next to the baby, who was sleeping peacefully. The soft light of a lamp illuminated the room, and Richard felt a pang of pain as he saw the expression on Tommy's face, a mixture of sadness and determination that shouldn't belong to a child so young. "Tommy," he said quietly, entering the room, "I know you're scared. I'm scared too, but I want you to know that I'm not going to let anyone hurt you. Do you trust me?" Tommy looked up at Richard, and for a moment it seemed like he was going to say something, but he stopped. Instead, he nodded slowly without saying a word. Richard approached and sat on the bed, resting a hand on the boy's shoulder. "I know you're carrying a heavy burden and it's not fair," Richard continued, his voice laden with emotion. "But you don't have to carry it alone. I'm here to help you, to protect you. Whatever you're holding inside, you don't have to face it by yourself." Tommy looked at him, and for the first time, Richard saw a flicker of something beyond distrust in his eyes. Perhaps it was hope, or maybe just the recognition that he wasn't alone anymore. Either way, Richard felt that he had taken a small step toward gaining the trust he so desperately wanted. That night, Richard left the door to the room slightly ajar as he left, as a sign that he was there for the children, ready for whatever might come. He knew that the battle against the ghosts of his past had just begun, and that he would need all the strength and determination to protect the children from the shadows looming over them. In the depths of the night, as the mansion sank into silence, Richard realized that for the first time in his life, he had something more to protect than his wealth. He had those children, and with them, a chance at redemption that he couldn't afford to lose. The days continued to be filled with tension at the Marlowe mansion. Richard tried to maintain his composure as the detective's investigation intensified, but inside the pressure was mounting. He knew that time was running out and that the threat of Victor Hargrove loomed over them like a sinister shadow. However, what Richard didn't suspect was that the danger was much closer than he imagined. One afternoon, while Richard was working in his study, he received an unexpected call from Detective Sarah Carter. Her voice, usually calm, had a note of urgency that put Richard on alert. "Mr. Marlowe, I need to speak with you. It's important," Sarah said without preamble. Richard felt something dark stirring in his stomach. "I'm in my study. You can come by whenever you want." It wasn't long before Sarah arrived at the mansion. Her expression was grave, and Richard immediately knew that things had taken an unexpected turn. He invited her to sit, but she remained standing, as if the situation was too urgent to allow for comfort. "We've found something," Sarah began, looking Richard directly in the eyes. "Something I didn't expect, but it explains a lot." Richard remained silent, waiting for her to continue. "During our investigation, we've been monitoring the movements of everyone in the mansion, not just yours," she explained. "A couple of days ago, we noticed that Mrs. Thompson, your housekeeper, has been acting suspiciously. This morning we found conclusive evidence that leads us to believe she has been in contact with Victor Hargrove for some time." Sarah's words hit Richard like a ton of bricks. Mrs. Thompson, the woman he had trusted for years, was betraying him. It felt as if the ground was crumbling beneath his feet. "What kind of evidence?" he managed to ask, his voice tense. Sarah pulled out a small recording device and placed it on the desk. "We intercepted a phone call between Mrs. Thompson and someone we believe is Hargrove. The conversation reveals that she has been providing information about you and the children. Hargrove manipulated her using an old debt she had, threatening her with consequences if she didn't cooperate." Richard felt a mix of anger and betrayal that took his breath away. He had trusted Mrs. Thompson, had considered her almost like part of the family, and now he discovered that she had been working against him from the beginning. "I can't believe this," he murmured, his mind spinning with the new information. "She betrayed me. All this time." Sarah nodded seriously. "We don't know the full extent of her involvement, but it's clear that her loyalty was bought by Hargrove. We need to confront her, but I wanted you to know before we proceed." Richard stood up, trying to control the anger boiling inside him. "Take me to her. I want to hear from her own mouth why she did this." Sarah led him to the servants' wing of the mansion, where Mrs. Thompson was in her room. When they arrived, they found her hurriedly packing a suitcase, as if she were ready to flee. When she saw Richard and Sarah at the door, Mrs. Thompson's expression shifted from surprise to fear. "Mr. Marlowe, she began to say, but the words caught in her throat. "Why?" Richard asked, his voice trembling with restrained anger. "Why did you betray me after all these years? How could you do this, especially to the children?" Mrs. Thompson lowered her head, tears beginning to well up in her eyes. "I had no choice," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Hargrove, he knew things about me, things that could ruin me. He threatened me, forced me to do it. I never wanted to hurt you, sir. I never wanted it to go this far." Richard felt his rage mix with a deep sadness. Although he understood that Hargrove had manipulated her, the betrayal was still painful. "What made you think that betraying me, betraying these children, was the only option?" he asked, unable to fully comprehend the magnitude of what she had done. "I was afraid," she responded, lifting her gaze to meet Richard's eyes. "But when I saw those children, I knew what I was doing was wrong. I tried to warn you, tried to find a way to stop it, but it was already too late. Last night, when I disabled the cameras and left the window open, I did it knowing I was making a terrible mistake. Please, forgive me." Richard felt a pang in his chest. Mrs. Thompson, despite her actions, seemed genuinely remorseful, but the damage was done and the children were in danger because of her. "Forgiving you won't change what you did," Richard said coldly. "Hargrove is using those children to get to me, and you gave him the tools to do it." Sarah, who had remained silent until then, stepped in. "Mr. Marlowe, we need to know where the children are now. Mrs. Thompson might have information that can help us find them before it's too late." Mrs. Thompson nodded weakly, knowing that her only redemption would be helping to save the children. "I know where he took them," she said, her voice trembling. "There's a property, an old house that belonged to the Hargrove family. He has them there." Sarah turned to Richard, who nodded with determination. There was no time to lose. With the knowledge of the location, they could organize a raid to rescue the children before Hargrove could carry out his final act of revenge. Before leaving the room, Richard looked at Mrs. Thompson one last time. "You stay here until the police come to get you," he said harshly. "You'll regret what you've done, but that doesn't change the fact that you've betrayed my trust in the worst possible way." Mrs. Thompson nodded, her tears falling silently as Richard and Sarah left the room. Armed with the information, Sarah quickly communicated with Detective Harris and the local police units. An operation was organized within minutes, and soon the Marlowe mansion became a hub of activity. Despite Sarah's recommendation to stay behind, Richard insisted on going with them. He couldn't stand by while the children he had come to consider his own were in danger. The drive to the old Hargrove property was tense. Richard could barely contain his anger and fear. He had been manipulated, betrayed by someone he trusted, but now all of that seemed irrelevant compared to the need to save the children. He felt an overwhelming responsibility for them and was determined to do whatever it took to protect them. When they arrived at the property, the scene was unsettling. The house, once elegant, now lay in ruins, surrounded by tall, dark trees. It seemed like the perfect setting for the final act of Hargrove's revenge. Richard, Sarah, and Harris, along with the other officers, approached cautiously, knowing that any misstep could be fatal. The tension in the air was palpable. Richard felt his heart pounding as they neared the entrance. He knew they were about to face a desperate and dangerous man, but there was no turning back. The children were inside, and he would not allow anything to happen to them. As the officers surrounded the house and prepared to enter, Richard looked at Sarah. There was a silent understanding between them. What was at stake went beyond any personal vendetta, beyond any redemption. It was a matter of life and death, and they both knew what had to be done. With one last glance at the entrance of the house, Richard took a deep breath, preparing for what was to come. He knew this confrontation would be the most difficult of his life, but he also knew he wasn't alone. With Sarah, Harris, and the others by his side, he was ready to face the ghosts of his past and save the children from the darkness that threatened to consume them. At that moment, Richard realized that this was his chance to redeem himself, to do the right thing, and he wasn't going to let anything or anyone stand in his way. The atmosphere around the old Hargrove property was thick with tension, as if the air itself anticipated the impending confrontation. The house, once a symbol of power and wealth, now stood in ruins, reflecting the state of its owner, Victor Hargrove, a man consumed by vengeance. Richard Marlowe, accompanied by Detectives Sarah Carter and John Harris, moved forward with calculated steps, knowing that any wrong move could cost them dearly. The police team had surrounded the property, preparing to enter from multiple angles. Despite warnings from Sarah and Harris, Richard insisted on leading the group, heading directly to the main entrance. He couldn't stay behind while the children, whom he now considered his responsibility, were in danger. He felt that the fate of his life was being played out in these moments. As they approached the house, the silence grew deeper, broken only by the crunch of branches underfoot and the whisper of the wind through the trees. Richard could feel the adrenaline beginning to take over his body, sharpening his senses and preparing him for what was to come. "Remember, we must proceed with caution," Harris whispered, motioning for the officers to take their positions. "Hargrove is a dangerous man, and we don't know how desperate he might be." Richard nodded, keeping his eyes fixed on the front door. He knew time wasn't on their side. Every passing second increased the risk to the children, and the thought of something happening to them tormented him. Finally, Harris gave the signal, and the team moved toward the entrance. Richard, alongside Sarah, forced the door, which gave way with a sinister creak. Inside, the house was dark and gloomy, the furniture covered in dust and the windows sealed, letting in only a faint ray of light. Everything in that place spoke of abandonment and despair, reflecting the soul of its owner. As they moved through the main hallway, Richard heard a noise coming from one of the side rooms. He signaled to Sarah, and together they headed toward the source of the sound, remaining alert to any movement. When they opened the door, they found an almost empty room, except for an old broken-down crib in the corner. Richard's heart stopped for a moment, fearing the worst, but the crib was empty. "The children must be in another part of the house," Sarah murmured, her face tense with worry. They continued moving forward, searching each room with growing desperation, Finally, they reached a door at the end of the hallway, from which a faint glow emanated. Richard felt a knot in his stomach, knowing that behind that door lay the confrontation he had been dreading and anticipating. Without waiting any longer, Harris gave the signal and the door was forced open. Inside the room, under the dim light of a lamp, sat Victor Hargrove, in a chair beside a table. Next to him on the floor were Tommy and the baby, tied up with fear in their eyes. Hargrove's face was marked by years of resentment and hatred, but also by a kind of sinister calm that could only come from someone who no longer feared the consequences of his actions. "Hargrove!" Richard shouted, moving toward him, but stopped when he saw Hargrove raise a hand, pointing a gun in the direction of the children. "Don't take another step, Marlowe," Hargrove said, his voice cold as ice. "You've finally come to face the consequences of your actions." Richard felt a mixture of rage and fear consuming him, but he knew he had to stay calm. Any wrong move could endanger the children. "You don't have to do this, Hargrove. What happened in the past, I regret it, but it's not these children you should punish." Hargrove let out a bitter laugh, as if Richard's words were a cruel joke. "You regret what you did? You regret destroying my life, taking away everything I loved? No, Marlowe, you have no idea the pain you caused, and now I'm going to give it back to you tenfold." Sarah, moving slowly, began to edge closer from the side, looking for an opportunity to disarm Hargrove without him noticing. However, Hargrove was alert, and his gaze fixed on her. "Don't even think about it, Detective," Hargrove warned, pointing the gun at Sarah. "Everyone will pay for what they did to me, and I'm going to start with what you love most." At that moment, Tommy, who had been silent the entire time, decided to act. With surprising bravery for a child his age, he lunged at Hargrove's arm, trying to knock the gun away. The surprise on Hargrove's face gave Sarah and Harris the opportunity they needed. In one swift move, Sarah tackled Hargrove, disarming him as Harris immobilized him. The gun clattered to the floor with a loud crash, and within seconds, Hargrove was handcuffed and placed under custody. Without wasting a moment, Richard rushed to Tommy and the baby, kneeling beside them. His heart was pounding as he untied the ropes that held them. "Tommy, you're safe," Richard murmured, hugging the boy tightly. "You're safe, it's all over." Tommy, still trembling from the adrenaline, clung to Richard, and for the first time since Richard had met him, the boy broke down in tears. They were tears of relief, fear, and all the weight he had carried on his small shoulders. Richard held them, feeling the accumulated tension beginning to dissipate. The baby, though frightened, was also safe in his arms. Richard felt a surge of relief and gratitude, knowing that despite everything that had happened, the children were okay. Hargrove, meanwhile, was escorted out of the room by Harris. His face was marked by bitter defeat, but also by a strange sense of relief, as if, in the end, he had found some twisted peace in his capture. When the police secured the property and took Hargrove away, Richard remained in the room with Tommy and the baby, unable to take his eyes off them. Sarah approached and placed a hand on his shoulder. "We did it," she said quietly. "They're safe, thanks to you." Richard nodded, unable to find the right words to respond. He had gone through so many emotions in such a short time that he felt overwhelmed. But in that moment, as he held the children in his arms, he knew it had all been worth it. He had faced his past, saved the children, and in the process found a purpose he never imagined he would have. As they left the house, Richard looked up at the sky, seeing the first light of dawn begin to break on the horizon. The darkness was finally fading, not just in the night, but in his life as well. And with the children by his side, he knew that although the road ahead would be difficult, he was ready to face it. Together, as a family. The sun slowly rose over the Marlowe mansion, illuminating every corner with a warmth that seemed to reflect the new beginning Richard felt inside. The days of chaos and tension were behind them, and with Victor Hargrove's capture, a dark shadow had lifted from his life. However, Richard knew that the true battle was only just beginning, the battle to build a new and meaningful life for Tommy, the baby, and for himself. After the rescue, Richard spent long hours in silence, reflecting on everything that had happened. The mansion, which had once been a symbol of his success and solitude, now felt different. There was laughter in the hallways, a gentle hum of life that hadn't existed before. Tommy and the baby, whom he now called Lucas, were beginning to adjust, and Richard found himself surprised by the deep affection he had developed for them. That morning, as they had breakfast together in the large kitchen, Richard watched the children with a sense of wonder. Tommy, though still bearing the emotional scars of his short but difficult life, had begun to open up. His eyes were no longer filled with fear but with a budding curiosity. Lucas, babbling happily, played with a spoon, filling the space with his laughter. Richard smiled, feeling a warmth in his chest that he had never experienced before. He had spent so much time focused on his business, on accumulating wealth, that he had forgotten what truly mattered. Now these children had taught him something no financial transaction could offer, the true value of human connection, of family. "Today is a special day," Richard said, addressing Tommy, who looked up from his plate with curiosity. "I want to talk to you both about the future." Tommy nodded, listening intently. Despite his young age, the boy was perceptive and understood more than Richard could have imagined. I've made a decision," Richard continued, his voice gentle but firm. "I want both of you to stay with me. Not as guests, but as part of my family. I want to adopt you, to be your father, if you agree." Tommy stared at him for a moment, processing what Richard had just said. The boy's eyes filled with tears, but this time they weren't from fear or sadness, but from relief and hope. Without saying a word, Tommy stood up from his chair and ran to Richard, throwing himself into his arms. Richard hugged him tightly, feeling that this small gesture spoke more than 1,000 words. "Does this mean Lucas and I are going to stay here forever?" Tommy asked, his voice trembling with emotion. "Yes, Tommy," Richard replied with a lump in his throat. "It means this is your home now, and it always will be. We are a family." Lucas, who didn't fully understand what was happening but sensed the emotion in the air, began to laugh, and his laughter spread to Richard and Tommy, who joined him in a shared laughter that filled the kitchen with a joy Richard had never known before. Later that day, Richard met with Sarah in his study. She had been a constant and reassuring presence over the past few days, and her support had been crucial in overcoming the challenges they faced. He knew that without her, he wouldn't have made it this far. "Sarah," Richard began with a mix of gratitude and sincerity in his voice, "I want to thank you for everything you've done. Without you, I don't know how I would have managed to face all of this. You didn't just help me save these children, you also showed me that there's more to life than work and money." Sarah smiled, her gaze soft and understanding. "Richard, it's been a difficult journey, but I'm happy to have been able to help. These children, they've found someone to trust in you, and that's the most important thing." Richard nodded, knowing that what they had shared during this time was special, but also knowing that his path now needed to focus on Tommy and Lucas. "Sarah, I want you to know that you'll always be a close friend to us. You've been a light in a dark moment, and we'll always be grateful to you." Sarah, understanding the meaning of his words, nodded with a warm smile. "I know, Richard. I'm sure you'll be a great father to them, and though our paths may be different, I'll always be here if you need me." With a hug that sealed their friendship, Sarah said her goodbyes, leaving Richard, Tommy, and Lucas to begin their new life together. The days that followed were filled with changes, but this time they were welcome changes. Richard began the legal process to adopt Tommy and Lucas. It was a long and complicated process, but with each document signed, he felt he was one step closer to solidifying the family he had found. The Marlowe mansion, once cold and empty, transformed into a vibrant and lively home. The rooms that had been vacant were now filled with toys, laughter, and memories in the making. The rigid and opulent structure of the house softened with the warmth of the new life it housed. Finally, the day when the adoption papers were approved arrived. Richard and the children went to the courthouse for the official ceremony, and although it was a simple event, it marked the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. When the judge signed the final documents, Richard felt a surge of emotion. He was no longer just a lonely millionaire. He was now a father, a protector, someone who had found his true purpose in life. Upon returning to the mansion, the family celebrated with a simple but meaningful dinner. As they sat at the table, Richard couldn't help but smile as he watched his children laughing together, enjoying the meal and each other's company. Tommy and Lucas were his family, and that gave him a peace and satisfaction he had never known before. That night, after putting the children to bed, Richard sat in the living room, gazing at the stars through the large windows. He reflected on everything that had happened, from the cold night when he found Tommy and Lucas on the street, to the moment he decided to adopt them and give them a home. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. There were challenges to face, wounds to heal, but he was ready to face it all with them. The trust and love they had begun to build together were the solid foundation on which their new life would rise. As he prepared to retire for the night, Richard took one last look around the mansion. He no longer saw a monument to his success, but a home filled with promises. He smiled, knowing he had found something far more valuable than anything money could buy. Alongside Tommy and Lucas, Richard embarked on a new chapter of his life, one filled with hope, love, and the certainty that, no matter what the future held, they would face it together, as a family. Thank you for joining us on this emotional journey. If you enjoyed the story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell to stay updated on more stories filled with emotion and drama. See you in the next chapter, where we'll continue exploring lives, emotions, and the magic of storytelling. Until next time.
"Helen, you're back," Michael said with a grin as I walked into the living room. His overly casual tone immediately set off alarm bells. "I am," I replied cautiously, setting my suitcase down. Something about his smug expression didn't sit right with me. "What's with the smile?" "Oh, nothing," he said, waving his hand as if brushing off my question. Then with a flourish, he added, "Well, I suppose you'll find out eventually. I made a major business move while you were away." I raised an eyebrow. "What kind of move?" He leaned back against the arm of the couch, his grin widening. "Your jewelry collection," he said, his voice dripping with satisfaction. "I sold it. Every piece. And before you get upset, let me just say, you'll thank me later. Your jewels funded my empire." I froze, my heart pounding as his words sank in. My jewelry collection, the pieces I'd spent years curating, some handed down from my mother and grandmother, others purchased with my own hard-earned money. Gone. "What did you just say?" I asked, my voice low and trembling. Michael laughed, clearly misreading my tone. "I said I sold it, Helen. Do you know how much those diamonds were worth? Enough to jumpstart a venture that's going to put us on the map. It's brilliant, really. You should be proud." Proud? My hands clenched into fists as anger surged through me. "You had no right, Michael. That was my jewelry. Do you even realize what you've done?" He rolled his eyes. "Oh, come on, it's not like you wore half of it. It was just sitting there collecting dust. This way, it's actually doing something useful." My name is Helen, and if there's one thing I've learned in my marriage to Michael, it's that his ambition always comes first. When we met, I admired his drive. He had big dreams, and I believed in them. But over the years, I started to see the cracks, how his charm masked a tendency to bulldoze anyone who got in his way. Still, I never thought he'd stoop this low. The jewelry collection wasn't just valuable. It was deeply personal. Every piece had a story, a connection to the life I'd built for myself. And now it was gone, just like that, because Michael had decided my possessions were his to use. But what Michael didn't know, what made his smug grin so infuriating, was that I wasn't as careless as he thought. A few months ago, after hearing about a string of local burglaries, I'd taken precautions. My most valuable pieces had discreet tracking devices embedded in their clasps. I forced myself to stay calm, hiding the storm of emotions brewing inside me. Michael thought he'd won, but the game had only just begun. That night, I sat in my bedroom, staring at the open drawer where my jewelry box used to be. The empty space felt like a void, a physical reminder of what Michael had stolen from me. The anger bubbling inside me was almost too much to contain. He hadn't just sold jewelry, he'd taken pieces of my history, things I could never replace. The sapphire ring my grandmother had given me on her 80th birthday. The diamond bracelet my mom wore on her wedding day. Even the gold pendant I'd bought for myself after landing my first big job. Every piece meant something, and Michael had tossed them away like they were nothing more than a stepping stone for his empire. My fingers hovered over my phone. I wanted to call him out right then and there, scream at him, demand answers. But I knew better than to confront him when I was this angry. Instead, I opened the tracking app I'd installed months ago. The screen lit up with a map, little red dots scattered across the city. My breath caught as I realized they were still active. My necklace was at a jewelry consignment store downtown. The bracelet? It had already moved to a warehouse in the industrial district. The app even showed timestamps, tracking the journey of my belongings as they changed hands. A grim sense of satisfaction replaced my anger. Michael might think he'd pulled one over on me, but I had something he didn't. Evidence. If the tracking data was accurate, I could not only find out where my pieces were, but also prove that Michael had stolen them. I picked up my phone and called Megan, my best friend and the one person I could always count on. "Megan," I said as soon as she answered, "you're not going to believe what Michael did." "What now?" she asked, already exasperated. I explained everything, the sale, his smug attitude, the tracking devices. By the time I finished, she was as furious as I was. "Helen, you have to go to the police," she said firmly. "I will," I said, feeling a flicker of determination. "First thing tomorrow." I ended the call and sat back, staring at the glowing dots on the screen. Michael had no idea what was coming, and for once I felt like I had the upper hand. The next morning I walked into the local police station, my phone in hand and my nerves wound tight. I'd never had to file a report like this before, but Megan's voice echoed in my head. "You have to go to the police." She was right. If I let Michael get away with this, he'd only push the boundaries further. At the front desk, a kind-looking officer greeted me. "How can we help you today?" "I need to report a theft," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Was it your property?" "Yes," I replied, taking a deep breath. "My jewelry collection. It was sold without my consent." The officer's eyebrows rose slightly, but he nodded. "Let's get some details." He motioned for me to follow him to a desk, where I explained everything. Michael's actions, the value of the jewelry, and the tracking devices I'd installed. When I showed him the app, his expression turned serious. "This is excellent evidence," he said, jotting down notes. "If these tracking devices are active, we may be able to retrieve some of the items. Do you have a list of what was taken?" "I do," I said, pulling out a notebook I'd filled with every piece and its approximate value. It felt strange, almost surreal, as the officer read through the list. The sapphire ring, the diamond bracelet, the gold pendant. They were more than just numbers on a page. They were pieces of my life, and now they were scattered across the city because of Michael's greed. The officer, whose name tag read Detective Carter, looked up from his notes. "We'll start by verifying the locations of the tracking signals. If the items are where you say they are, this could be a straightforward recovery. However, since your husband sold them without your consent, this also constitutes fraud. Are you prepared to pursue charges?" I hesitated, the weight of his question pressing down on me. "Yes," I said finally. "I want him held accountable." Detective Carter nodded, his expression resolute. "Good. Let's get started." As I left the station, a mix of emotions churned inside me. Relief, knowing the police were taking this seriously. Anger, remembering Michael's smug grin when he told me what he'd done. And most of all, determination. For years, I'd let Michael take and take, convincing myself it wasn't worth the fight. But this time was different. This time I was fighting back. By the time I got home, the adrenaline from filing the report had started to fade, leaving me with a mix of exhaustion and anxiety. I replayed the conversation with Detective Carter in my mind, wondering how Michael would react once he realized the police were involved. The thought didn't sit well. Michael had always been good at spinning situations to his advantage, turning himself into the victim no matter how egregious his actions were. I'd seen it before, how he could charm his way out of responsibility with a smile and a clever excuse. But this time, he didn't know I was one step ahead. That evening, Megan came over, a bottle of wine in hand. "Okay," she said, settling onto my couch. "Tell me everything. How did it go at the station?" I filled her in, from the evidence I'd shown Detective Carter to his plan to track down the pieces. She listened intently, her expression a mix of outrage and admiration. "You're handling this better than I would," she said when I finished. "If it were me, I'd probably be at his office flipping desks right now." I laughed despite myself. "Trust me, I've thought about it. But the police have the tracking data, and I think that's my best shot at getting everything back." "Good," Megan said, raising her glass. "To you, for not letting that smug jerk get away with this." The next day, I got a call from Detective Carter. "We've verified the locations of the items," he said. "2 are at a consignment store downtown, and another is in a warehouse. We've secured cooperation from the store owners and are moving forward with retrieval. I'll keep you updated as we progress." The relief was immediate. "Thank you," I said, gripping the phone tightly. "Does this mean I'll get them back?" "It's looking good," he replied. "But the investigation is still ongoing. We've also flagged your husband's financial activities. I don't want to alarm you, but there may be more going on than just the jewelry sale." My stomach dropped. "What do you mean?" "There are some unusual transactions linked to his business accounts," Detective Carter explained. "We'll need to look into it further, but this could be bigger than we initially thought." As I hung up the phone, my mind raced. Michael hadn't just betrayed me. He might have been hiding an entirely different side of himself. The idea that Michael's betrayal could run even deeper haunted me for the rest of the day. I paced the kitchen, replaying Detective Carter's words. This could be bigger than we initially thought. What else had Michael been hiding from me? Later that evening, I decided to confront him. If there was more to this than the jewelry sale, I needed to know. When he walked through the door, his smug grin irritated me more than usual. He tossed his keys on the counter and said, "Busy day. What's for dinner?" I didn't even try to hide my anger. "Michael," I said, crossing my arms, "we need to talk. Now." His grin faltered, replaced by a wary expression. "What's wrong?" "What's wrong?" I repeated, my voice sharp. "You stole my jewelry to fund your so-called empire, and now the police are investigating you." The color drained from his face, but he quickly tried to recover. "Police? What are you talking about?" "I didn't steal anything, Helen. That jewelry was just sitting there, collecting dust. I thought you'd be happy it was being put to good use." I shook my head, disgusted by his audacity. "Put to good use? Michael, you had no right to touch my things. And now the police are looking into your finances, and they think there's more to this than just the jewelry." His expression shifted, anger flashing in his eyes. "You went to the police?" he hissed. "You're turning this into a circus. Why couldn't you just talk to me like an adult?" "Because talking to you doesn't work," I shot back. "You always find a way to twist things or talk yourself out of trouble. This time, there's evidence, and you can't charm your way out of it." Michael stared at me, his jaw tightening. "You've made a huge mistake, Helen. If you think you can tear me down like this, you've got another thing coming." I didn't flinch. "No, Michael. The only mistake I made was trusting you, but that ends now." The silence between us was heavy as he glared at me, his confidence cracking. For once, he didn't have a snappy comeback or a smug excuse. He simply stormed out of the kitchen, slamming the door behind him. I stood there for a long time, my heart pounding. This wasn't just about reclaiming what was mine anymore. This was about standing up for myself, for everything I'd let Michael take from me over the years. And I wasn't backing down. The next day, I received another call from Detective Carter. His tone was steady, but there was a weight to his words. Mrs. Parker, we've recovered 3 of the items so far, including the diamond bracelet and sapphire ring. The rest are being traced to other locations, but we've hit an unexpected development. What kind of development? I asked, gripping the phone tightly. We've uncovered financial transactions linked to your husband's business that suggest fraudulent activity. Some of these funds appear to overlap with the sale of your jewelry, but others involve external accounts that raise red flags. We're expanding the investigation. I sat down, the weight of his words pressing on my chest. Michael wasn't just selfish. He was reckless. What does this mean for me? I asked cautiously. For now, you're not implicated, Detective Carter reassured me. But it's important that you remain cooperative and provide any additional information we request. Your husband's actions could have serious legal consequences. I hung up and stared at the phone in disbelief. What had Michael gotten himself into? Selling my jewelry was bad enough, but fraud? I felt like I was living with a stranger, someone I no longer recognized. That evening, I called Megan. The police think Michael's involved in something bigger, I said, pacing the living room. They're looking into his business accounts. Megan didn't sound surprised. Honestly, Helen, I'm not shocked. The way he carries himself, like the rules don't apply to him, it was only a matter of time before it caught up with him. But how could I not have seen this? I asked, my voice breaking. I married him, trusted him, and now everything feels like a lie. Megan's tone softened. You couldn't have known, Helen. He's good at hiding things, at manipulating people. But this isn't your fault. You're doing the right thing by standing up for yourself. Her words gave me some comfort, but the anger and betrayal still churned inside me. Later that night, Michael came home. His usual confidence was gone, replaced by an air of frustration and barely contained rage. I know what you've been doing, he said, his voice low and venomous. The police, the bank. Do you have any idea what kind of damage you've caused? I didn't cause this, Michael, I said, meeting his glare. You did. And now you're finally facing the consequences. He laughed bitterly. You think you've won? This isn't over, Helen. You're right, I said calmly. It's not over. But it's out of your hands now. For the first time, I saw fear flicker in his eyes. The following morning, I received another call from Detective Carter. Mrs. Parker, he began, his tone steady but serious. We've recovered several more items from your jewelry collection. They were traced to a private auction house downtown. Relief washed over me. Does that mean I'll get them back soon? I asked, my voice trembling with a mix of hope and exhaustion. Yes, Detective Carter confirmed. We're working through the legal process to return the recovered items to you. But there's another development. The financial records tied to your husband's business show evidence of tax evasion and embezzlement. It's a growing case. Hearing those words didn't surprise me anymore. By this point, I'd come to accept that Michael wasn't just careless. He was deeply unethical. I thanked Detective Carter and hung up, my resolve hardening. I couldn't let Michael's actions drag me down any further. That afternoon, I took the first tangible step toward reclaiming my independence. I contacted a lawyer Megan had recommended, someone who specialized in both family law and financial recovery. Sitting in her office, I explained everything, from the theft of my jewelry to the unfolding police investigation. This is a mess, she said, flipping through her notes. But the good news is, you've already done a lot to protect yourself by going to the authorities. We can file for a formal separation and begin securing your personal assets. Hearing those words was both terrifying and empowering. I'd never imagined I'd be sitting in a lawyer's office, planning to disentangle my life from my husband's. But after everything Michael had done, I knew it was the only way forward. What about his business? I asked. Could this affect me financially? Potentially, she replied. That's why it's important to establish clear boundaries now. If his business is under investigation, we need to ensure your finances are protected. Later that evening, as I reviewed the paperwork the lawyer had given me, Megan called to check in. "How are you holding up?" she asked. "I'm okay," I said, surprising even myself with the honesty of the statement. For the first time in weeks, I feel like I'm in control. It's not easy, but I know I'm doing the right thing. "You are," Megan said firmly, "and you're stronger than you realize, Helen. Don't forget that." As I hung up, I glanced at the stack of documents on the table. The road ahead wasn't going to be easy, but for the first time I felt ready to face it. 2 days later, I met Detective Carter at the station to review the progress of the investigation. "Mrs. Parker," he said, gesturing for me to sit across from him, "we've traced almost all of your jewelry and confirmed it was sold through high-value channels. The auction house and consignment stores involved have provided full cooperation." "That's a relief," I said, feeling a small weight lift off my shoulders. "And Michael? What's happening with him?" Detective Carter leaned forward, folding his hands on the desk. "The evidence against him is significant. Between the unauthorized sale of your jewelry and the fraud tied to his business accounts, the DA is preparing charges. He's not going to walk away from this." Hearing those words filled me with a mix of satisfaction and sadness. Michael's actions had hurt me deeply, but knowing he would face consequences was a step toward justice. That evening, Michael came home late. I was sitting in the living room, surrounded by legal documents and paperwork from the bank. He stopped in the doorway, his face hard and defensive. "What is all this?" he asked, nodding toward the papers. "Divorce filings," I said evenly, not looking up from the page I was reviewing. His eyes widened, and for a moment I saw genuine shock on his face. "You're divorcing me?" he asked, his voice tinged with disbelief. "Yes, Michael," I said, meeting his gaze. "This is the end. I won't let you drag me down with you any further." He scoffed, running a hand through his hair. "You think you're going to come out of this unscathed? I built everything for us, Helen. Everything I've done was for this family." I laughed bitterly. "You didn't do it for us. You did it for yourself. You stole from me, lied to me, and left me to clean up your messes. This family? It was always just about you." He stared at me, his confidence slipping away with each word. "You don't mean this?" he said finally. "You can't mean this." "I do," I said firmly, "and you'll see just how serious I am when you're served." For the first time since this ordeal began, Michael was speechless. He turned and stormed out of the room, slamming the door behind him. I exhaled deeply, the sound of the door echoing in my ears. This wasn't just the end of my marriage, it was the beginning of reclaiming my life. The next morning, I got a call from my lawyer. "Helen, the papers have been filed. Michael will be served later today," she said, her tone professional but empathetic. I let out a breath I didn't realize I was holding. "Thank you," I said softly. "Helen, I know this is a tough process," she added, "but you've handled this with strength and clarity. Keep focusing on your next steps. We're in your corner." After the call, I sat at the kitchen table with my coffee, staring out the window. For weeks, my life had felt like a whirlwind of betrayal, anger, and frustration. But now, for the first time, there was a sense of clarity. The pieces of my jewelry were being recovered, the police investigation was progressing, and the divorce filings marked a definitive break from the chaos Michael had brought into my life. That afternoon, Detective Carter called with more updates. "Mrs. Parker, I wanted to let you know that charges are being formally filed against your husband. Between the unauthorized sale of your property and the financial fraud linked to his business accounts, he's facing multiple counts." I felt a wave of relief wash over me. "Does this mean I'll be able to recover everything he sold?" "It's likely," Detective Carter replied. "The evidence is strong, and the cooperating parties have agreed to release the items back to you as soon as the case progresses. But more importantly, the justice system is holding him accountable." "Thank you," I said, my voice steady. When I hung up, I realized something profound. I wasn't angry anymore. I wasn't consumed by the betrayal or the need to make Michael pay. I was simply ready to move on. That evening, I met Megan for dinner. She raised her glass with a grin. "To Helen," she said, "the woman who didn't just survive, she thrived." I laughed, clinking my glass against hers. "I don't know if I'd call it thriving just yet, but I'll take it." Megan leaned in, her expression serious. "You're stronger than you think, Helen. You took control when it mattered most. Don't forget that." Her words stayed with me as I drove home that night. For years, I'd let Michael's ambition overshadow my own sense of self-worth. But now, as I looked ahead, I saw nothing but possibilities. A week later, I received a call from Detective Carter. "Mrs. Parker," he said, his tone lighter than before, "I wanted to let you know we've recovered all but one piece of your jewelry. The remaining item is still being traced, but the majority of your collection is ready for you to reclaim." Hearing those words felt like the final piece of a heavy burden being lifted off my shoulders. "Thank you, Detective," I said, relief evident in my voice. "I can't tell you how much this means to me." "We're just doing our job," he replied. "But if I may say, you've handled the situation with remarkable strength. Not everyone takes the steps you did." After the call, I made my way to the precinct to collect the recovered items. As I held the sapphire ring my grandmother had given me and the diamond bracelet from my mother, I felt a deep sense of closure. These weren't just pieces of jewelry. They were symbols of the life I'd worked so hard to preserve, now returned to me. The day Michael was formally charged, I received a curt message from him. "You really had to drag this out, didn't you? I hope you're happy now." I didn't respond. There was no point. Michael had made his choices, and now he was facing the consequences. My energy was better spent on myself, on rebuilding, on moving forward. That evening, I went through the remaining paperwork with my lawyer. "Once the divorce is finalized, your financial separation from him will be complete," she said. "His debts won't touch you." "Thank you," I said, feeling a weight lift. "That's exactly what I need." It wasn't until later that night, sitting in my quiet, newly peaceful home, that I realized how much had changed. The betrayal, the anger, the hurt, it was all still there, but it no longer consumed me. I'd learned how to set boundaries, how to fight for myself, and how to let go of what I couldn't control. Megan called to check in, her usual upbeat tone lifting my spirits. "So, what's next for Helen Parker?" she asked. "Honestly," I said, smiling for the first time in what felt like forever. "Anything I want." As I hung up, I looked around my home. Not just a house, but my space, reclaimed and safe. For the first time in years, I felt like I could truly breathe. Michael's actions had tested me in ways I never expected, but I'd come out stronger. And now my future was finally mine to define.
My parents canceled my 18th birthday party last minute because my golden child sister threw a fit about her trip being canceled. Okay, so I just turned 18 last week, and what was supposed to be like a big deal for me turned into a disaster. You'd think turning 18 would be a huge thing, right? But nah, my parents ruined the whole thing. They canceled my party at the very last minute, and the reason? My spoiled, selfish older sister threw a fit. Honestly, the party was supposed to be all about me. I mean, 18 is a big deal, but nope, she just had to make it about herself like she always does. Here's the thing, she wasn't even supposed to be home. She had this big trip planned with her friends to New York, and I was low-key excited that she'd be gone during my birthday. It was going to be the first time in years that I could have something without her stealing the spotlight. But of course, because I can't have nice things, there was a massive storm in the Midwest that screwed up all the flights. Her trip got canceled, and now I'm stuck with her at home on my birthday. So, it's the morning of my birthday. I'm pretty hyped, thinking it's finally going to be my day, right? But then, my sister wakes up in one of her moods. She's upset about the trip getting canceled. And when I say upset, I mean she's acting like the world is ending. I tried to ignore her and focus on getting ready, but my parents were all over her, babying her like she's some delicate little flower. And this is where it gets messed up. Out of nowhere, she says to my parents, If I can't go to New York and have fun, then nobody should. I swear I thought she was joking. Like, who says that? But my parents didn't even blink. They just nodded and were like, "You're right. It wouldn't be fair to have a party when she's so upset." I was standing there like, what? How the hell is her trip getting canceled my fault? They didn't even have the decency to tell me right away. I only found out hours later when it was already evening, and no one had shown up yet. I was sitting there fully dressed, waiting for my friends to come over, and then I'm like, wait, why hasn't anyone arrived? So I asked my mom what was going on, and that's when she casually drops the bomb that they canceled the party because my sister was too upset to deal with it. They didn't even think to ask me. They just made the decision like my birthday didn't matter at all. I lost it. Like full-on screaming, angry tears type of lost it. This wasn't just about the party being canceled, you know? It was about everything. For as long as I can remember, I've been pushed aside for my sister. I'm always the one who has to adjust, compromise, and let her have whatever she wants. They've been doing this my whole life, and I've always just put up with it because, I don't know, that's what I was used to. But this, canceling my 18th birthday party because she's whining about not going on some stupid trip, that was just too much. I started yelling at them, and you know what they did? They told me to quiet down because they didn't want to wake up my sister from her nap. Can you believe that? I'm furious. My entire birthday is ruined, and they're more worried about my sister getting her beauty sleep. Right in the middle of this mess, the doorbell rings. My parents didn't invite anyone, so they were confused. They open the door, and it's my grandpa. Now, my grandpa's not just some regular grandpa. He's the kind of guy who commands respect. Everyone in the family listens to him, even my parents. He's old school, strict, but fair. And honestly, he's one of the few people I actually trust in the family. So he walks in and immediately sees that something's wrong. He hears me still yelling, sees my parents looking like they've been caught doing something shady, and he's like, "What's going on here?" My parents tried to brush it off like it was nothing, but Grandpa wasn't buying it. He turns to me, and I just unloaded everything. I told him about how my sister's always been the golden child, how they canceled my birthday without even telling me, how they always put her first no matter what. I wasn't holding back. I was tired of keeping quiet about it. My grandpa was pissed, like visibly angry. I've never seen him so mad. He turns to my dad and says, "Is this true?" My dad tries to downplay it, saying, "Oh, well, she was upset, and we thought it would be best to keep things quiet." But Grandpa wasn't having it. He snapped and started going off on them. He said they've been coddling my sister her whole life and ignoring me, and that it was disgusting how they treated me. And then he drops the real shocker. Turns out, for the past few years, my grandpa has been the one supporting our family financially. My parents have been struggling to keep their business afloat, and Grandpa's been sending them money every month to help out. So this party they canceled, Grandpa paid for it. The whole time, I thought my parents were doing something nice for me, but nope, it was all thanks to Grandpa. He went off on my parents even harder after that. He said they were ungrateful, and that if they couldn't even treat their own daughter right, they didn't deserve his help. Then in front of everyone, he tells them that he's done. No more money. They're cut off. And then he turns to me and says, "Pack your bags. You're coming with me." I didn't even think twice. I ran upstairs, grabbed whatever I could, and left with him. My parents tried to stop me, saying things like, "Oh, don't be so dramatic, and we can fix this." But I was done. Grandpa didn't even look back at them. We got in his car, and as we drove away, he apologized to me. He said he should have stepped in sooner, and that he didn't realize how bad things had gotten. I didn't even know what to say. I was just grateful to be out of there. Now I'm staying at my grandpa's house, and honestly, it's the best thing that's happened to me in a long time. My parents have been texting me nonstop, trying to get me to come back, but I'm not going to. I'm done with them. They only care about my sister, and now that Grandpa's cut them off, they're probably more worried about the money than they are about me. It's messed up, but at least now I know where I stand with them. All right, so after I moved in with my grandpa, things started to get, well, kind of weird. You know how when you finally take a stand against something, and then everyone around you starts acting all different, like they don't know how to handle it? That's exactly what happened with my parents. The minute I walked out, they went into panic mode. But not in the "we care about you" way. It was more like they realized they'd messed up and were trying to fix it just to save face. First off, they didn't even wait 24 hours before texting me. My phone was blowing up the next morning. At first it was all, "We're sorry, we didn't think," and "Your sister was just so upset we didn't realize how it'd affect you." Yeah, right. Like they didn't know that canceling my 18th birthday party without telling me would piss me off. It was like they were scrambling for excuses, but none of them made sense. They kept saying stuff like, "We always thought you were strong enough to handle it," and "Your sister just needs more attention sometimes, you know how she is." I mean, come on. They were seriously trying to play it like I should be proud of being ignored because it meant they thought I was strong? That's some next level manipulation, if you ask me. But then they dropped this wild excuse that actually made me laugh. My mom sent this long text about how my sister's more fragile and how she's always been the one who needs more emotional support. Like, where was this coming from? My sister's 23 years old. She's been out of college for 2 years and has a job. If anything, she should be the one handling her emotions like an adult, not me. At that point, I wasn't even mad anymore. It was just sad. They were clearly grasping at straws, trying to make me feel guilty for standing up for myself. But I didn't bite. I just ignored the text and didn't respond. I figured they'd get the hint eventually, right? Wrong. 2 days later, my dad sent me a message. He basically begged me to come home and talk things out. I hadn't responded to anything by then, and I think it was really freaking them out. He said that they wanted to apologize in person and make things right. But here's the thing. I didn't believe them for a second. They didn't care about making things right with me. They were just scared about Grandpa cutting them off financially, and they wanted me to go back so they could get back in his good graces. I thought about it for a while, though. I'll admit, part of me wanted to see if they'd actually follow through with any of this fake apology stuff, so I decided to test them. I sent a message back to my dad, and this is where things got interesting. I told him straight up, I'll come back home and talk to Grandpa about keeping the financial support going, but only if you kick my sister out of the house. Now, I wasn't really expecting them to do it. I mean, they'd never pick me over her, but I just wanted to see how far they'd go to get me back. The reply I got was hilarious. My dad sent this long, dramatic message about how I was being unreasonable and heartless. He said that my sister has nowhere else to go, and that it wasn't fair of me to ask them to choose between their 2 daughters. I almost choked laughing at that. Choose between us? They'd already chosen. They chose my sister every single time for my entire life. I didn't even bother responding to that one either. It was pretty clear where I stood. My parents were never going to see me as anything but second best. So I let it go, figuring they'd eventually stop messaging me. But nope, they didn't give up that easily. A few days later, I was leaving school with my friend, the football player I mentioned last chapter. He's been my rock through all this. And I see my sister standing outside waiting for me. And listen, when I tell you I got a bad feeling about it, I mean it. She wasn't smiling. She wasn't even trying to act nice. She just stood there, glaring at me like I was the enemy. I was honestly creeped out, so I asked my friend to walk me home. He's a big guy, and I knew if she tried to pull anything, he'd be there to step in. We've known each other for years, and he knows all about my family drama, so he was cool with walking me back. As we started heading home, my sister started following us. Silently. No yelling, no calling my name. Just walking a few steps behind us like some kind of creepy stalker. At first, I tried to ignore her, but after a few blocks, it got way too weird. I stopped, turned around, and straight up asked her what she wanted. She said, I'm not talking to you in front of him. Like, okay, sure, that's not suspicious at all, right? I told her if she had something to say, she could say it now. But I wasn't going to go off alone with her. No way. I didn't trust her one bit. That's when she launched into this whole thing about how I was destroying our family. She said our parents were stressed because of me, and that they'd told her about the condition I'd set, that I'd only come back if she moved out. She was pissed. She called me unfair and selfish and said that I was ruining her life. All I could do was laugh at how ridiculous it sounded. Like, really? I'm ruining her life? I told her, if I can't be happy, then neither can you. I know it was petty, but that's the exact same reasoning she used to cancel my birthday party. So I figured it was only fair. I turned around to keep walking, and that's when she snapped. Before I knew it, she lunged at me and shoved me to the ground. I didn't even have time to react. 1 second I was standing there, and the next, I was on the pavement with her on my back, screaming in my ear. But my friend, bless him, was quick. He grabbed her by the arm and literally lifted her off me like she was nothing. The guy's got muscles for days, so he wasn't even breaking a sweat. When I got up, I was furious. I walked right up to her, slapped her hard across the face, and told her that if she ever touched me again, I'd call the cops. I was done playing nice. She looked stunned, like she couldn't believe I'd actually hit her, but she didn't try to come at me again, probably because she knew my friend would stop her. I didn't wait for her to say anything else. I just turned around and walked away with my friend. When I got home, I told my grandpa what happened, and he was ready to call the cops right then and there, but I told him it wasn't worth it. My sister's a mess, and honestly, I felt like she'd already dug her own grave with our parents. I didn't need to do anything more, but man, slapping her felt good. Real good. It was a long time coming. So, after the whole mess with my sister attacking me, I thought things might finally calm down. But nah, that's not how things work in my family. Instead, things just kept getting weirder. My parents didn't call or text me for a few days after that, and I figured they had finally given up. But then, I got hit with something completely unexpected. A phone call from my grandpa, and this time, it was him dropping a bomb on me. Wait, I know I said no more bombs, but you get what I mean, right? He starts the conversation super serious, saying he needs to talk to me about some stuff I didn't know. I thought maybe he was going to talk about money or something, maybe explain why my parents are so screwed up when it comes to my sister and me. But no, it was way bigger than that. So, he tells me the reason my parents have always treated me like crap. Apparently, they never even wanted me in the first place. Yeah, you read that right. I was literally an unwanted kid. My mom and dad had only planned on having one child, my sister. She was their perfect daughter, and they were happy with just her. Then, 5 years after she was born, my mom got pregnant with me by accident. At first, they planned to have an abortion. They weren't ready for another kid, and they didn't want their perfect little family of 3 to change. But then my dad made the mistake of telling my maternal grandparents, my mom's parents, about the pregnancy. And they were old school, super traditional people. They were totally against abortion, so they convinced my parents to keep me. But here's where it gets even worse. When my mom was 8 months pregnant, my grandparents got into this horrible car accident, and both of them died. My grandpa explained that my mom blamed me for the accident. She started saying it was because of me that her parents were gone, like I was some kind of curse. She had a total breakdown, like full-on psychotic episode while she was pregnant. She had to be institutionalized for a few weeks to get her head right. By the time she came back, she was better, but she still had these feelings deep down. It didn't help that my dad felt the same way, like having me was some kind of punishment they didn't deserve. They were ready to give me up for adoption as soon as I was born, but here's where my paternal grandparents stepped in. My dad's parents refused to let them do it. They thought it was ridiculous, and told my parents that they had to raise me, whether they liked it or not. So yeah, they didn't want me, but they had no choice. And that's why they've always treated me like I'm the extra kid who wasn't supposed to be here. I sat there on the phone just trying to process all of this, like everything suddenly made sense. Why I was always second place to my sister, why they never seemed to care about me the same way, and why I always felt like I didn't belong. I mean, they didn't want me, so of course they treated me like I didn't matter. I asked my grandpa why he never told me this before. He sighed and said he didn't want to burden me with the truth when I was younger, especially since I was just a kid. He thought maybe things would change, that my parents would come around and see me as their daughter, but obviously, that never happened. Hearing this from my grandpa was both a relief and a punch to the gut. It explained so much, but it also made me realize that no matter what I did, I was never going to be enough for them. I was never going to be the kid they wanted, because they didn't want me at all. I didn't even know what to say after that. I just kind of sat there in silence, trying to absorb it all. My grandpa must have realized how much it was hitting me, because he told me that I was better off with him now. He said he should have taken me away from them a long time ago, but he didn't want to stir up trouble back then. I could tell he regretted not stepping in sooner, but at least now I knew the truth. After I hung up with my grandpa, I just sat there for a while, thinking about how messed up everything really was. Like, what do you even do with that kind of information? My parents literally saw me as some kind of mistake, and all this time I'd been fighting for their approval, hoping one day they'd see me the same way they saw my sister. But now I knew that was never going to happen. They couldn't, because to them, I was always going to be the kid that wasn't supposed to exist. I didn't tell my grandpa this, but after hearing all of that, I knew for sure I was never going back home. There was no way. Even if they did kick my sister out like I jokingly asked, it wouldn't change anything. I wasn't some kid they cared about losing. I was just a problem they didn't want to deal with. That night, I got another text from my dad. It was long, trying to convince me to come home and saying that they realized they'd made mistakes and that they wanted to make things right. I almost threw my phone when I read it. How can you make something right when the whole foundation is screwed up? They didn't want me from the start, and nothing they said now would change that. I didn't respond. I couldn't. What was the point? They'd just lie or give me some half-assed excuse. It wasn't even about me for them. They were still trying to save face, trying to patch things up with Grandpa so the money would keep coming. And honestly, I wasn't going to be their pawn in that game anymore. I went downstairs that night and talked to my grandpa face to face. I told him everything I'd been feeling since we had that phone call, how I finally understood why things were the way they were, and how I didn't think I could ever forgive my parents for treating me like this. He listened, like he always does, and when I was done, he gave me this look, like he understood completely. He told me that I didn't owe my parents anything, that I should focus on myself, on my future, and not waste time trying to fix what couldn't be fixed. That's when I made the decision. I was never going back. My parents could keep texting, keep apologizing, keep making excuses, but I was done with them. All right, so after I found out the truth about why my parents never wanted me, I thought things couldn't get any worse. Like, that was pretty much rock bottom, right? Turns out I was wrong. Things took a whole new turn with my sister, and honestly, I should have seen it coming, but somehow it still caught me off guard. So about a week after my grandpa told me the whole story, I hadn't heard much from my parents. They texted me a few times saying the same old stuff, trying to act like they cared about me, but I didn't respond. I was done with their crap, and honestly, I was more focused on just trying to move on with my life. But my sister? She wasn't going to let things go that easily. One afternoon, I was chilling at Grandpa's place, just trying to relax after school. I had some homework to do, but I wasn't really feeling it, so I was just scrolling through my phone. Out of nowhere, my phone buzzes, and it's a message from my sister. Now, I hadn't heard from her since the whole fight in the street when she tried to tackle me. So seeing her name pop up was a surprise. I opened the message, and it was a whole essay. She started by saying how messed up it was that I was making her out to be the bad guy. Like, she was seriously trying to act like she was the victim in all of this. She said that our parents were super stressed because of me, and that it was unfair how I left without talking things out. I couldn't believe what I was reading. Then she goes on to say that I need to stop being selfish and come home so we can fix things as a family. She actually used the word selfish, like I hadn't spent my entire life getting pushed aside so she could have whatever she wanted. The audacity of her trying to guilt trip me after everything was almost laughable. But the part that really pissed me off was when she said, "You've always been jealous of me, and I get it, but you need to grow up and stop acting like a brat." I nearly threw my phone across the room. Jealous? Jealous of her? The girl who had everything handed to her while I was treated like an afterthought? I wasn't jealous. I was tired. Tired of being treated like crap and then being blamed for everything. I didn't respond to her message. I didn't need to. I wasn't going to get dragged into another pointless argument with her. But the next day, things escalated, and it got way more real than I expected. After school, I was heading back to Grandpa's house, and as I walked up to the front door, I saw my sister standing there, just standing, waiting for me. I almost turned around and left right then and there, but I didn't want her to think I was scared or something, so I walked up to her and asked, "What do you want?" She didn't even look mad at first, which threw me off. Instead, she looked desperate, like something was seriously wrong. I figured she was about to try and manipulate me into coming back home, so I was already on guard. But what she said next was not what I expected at all. She told me that our parents had finally told her everything. They told her about how they never wanted me, how they only planned on having one kid, and how I was some unwanted mistake. And for the first time in, well, ever, she actually looked guilty. She said she didn't know things were that bad and that if she had known, she would have acted differently. I didn't believe her. I couldn't. My sister had spent our entire lives lording over me, being the golden child, and taking advantage of every little bit of favoritism she could. Now she was standing there, acting like she suddenly cared? Nah, it didn't sit right with me. I told her straight up, "You've known for years that they treated me differently, and you never cared. You just loved being the favorite. Don't act like you're sorry now that it's too late." I wasn't trying to be mean, but I also wasn't about to let her rewrite history like she'd been this innocent bystander. That's when she broke down. I mean, full-on sobbing, right there on the front porch. I didn't know what to do. My sister never cries. At least not like that. She just kept saying, I didn't know, over and over again. I was honestly in shock. I stood there awkwardly, waiting for her to stop, but it just kept going. Finally, I managed to ask, "What do you want from me? Why are you here?" She looked up at me with tears streaming down her face and said, "I want you to come home. I don't want to do this without you." That threw me off. Do what without me? What was she talking about? I asked her what she meant, and she said that ever since I left, things had gotten worse at home. Our parents were fighting constantly, the house felt empty, and she didn't know how to handle it. She said it was like everything was falling apart, and she needed me to come back and make things better. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. After everything she put me through, now she was asking me to fix things? I didn't even know what to say at first. Part of me wanted to yell at her, tell her she was crazy for thinking I'd go back after all this. But another part of me just felt Sad. Sad that she didn't get it. Sad that she thought I could magically fix a family that was broken way before I left. I took a deep breath and told her the truth. I'm not coming back. I can't. This isn't something I can fix. Our parents are messed up, and you know that. You just didn't care before because it didn't affect you. She tried to argue, saying that things could change if we worked together, but I wasn't buying it. I told her that I wasn't going to be the scapegoat anymore, that I wasn't going to go back to a house where I was never wanted. I told her she needed to stop blaming me for the mess our parents created. She didn't take it well. She started yelling, saying that I was being selfish, that I was abandoning her. It was the same old stuff she'd been saying for years, just with more tears this time. But I didn't budge. I wasn't going to let her guilt me into going back to that toxic environment. Eventually, she realized I wasn't going to change my mind, and she stormed off. I watched her walk down the street still crying, and for a second, I felt a little bad. But then I reminded myself that this was her problem to deal with now. I wasn't going to let her drag me back into that mess. That night, I told my grandpa what happened, and he just nodded, like he knew this was coming. He didn't say much, but I could tell he was proud of me for standing my ground. I was proud of myself too. For the first time in my life, I wasn't letting my sister or my parents control me. I was finally free. All right, so after that whole thing with my sister breaking down on my grandpa's front porch, I thought, okay, maybe this is it. Maybe she finally got the message. I mean, how many times can one person beg and cry before they get that someone just isn't coming back? But I guess in my family, they don't know how to quit because things got even crazier after that. For a few days, it was quiet. No messages from my parents, no surprise visits from my sister. Honestly, it was kind of peaceful. I started getting used to living at my grandpa's house, feeling like things were starting to turn around. I didn't have to deal with my parents' constant favoritism or my sister's tantrums. For once, I could just breathe, you know? But of course, that didn't last long. About a week after my sister's meltdown, I got another text from my dad. Now, by this point, I had pretty much written them off. I knew they weren't going to change, and I was done with the whole situation. But this text? This one caught me off guard because it wasn't the same "come home, we can fix this" crap they'd been saying before. Instead, it was more like, "We've made a decision." My dad said that after a lot of thought, they were going to let my sister keep living with them because, in his words, she's family, and we can't turn our backs on her. He followed that up with, "Since you've made it clear you don't want to come home, we're not going to push anymore." And here's the kicker. Sorry, had to use it this one time. He basically admitted they only wanted me back because of Grandpa's financial support. He didn't even try to sugarcoat it. He said something like, "We thought maybe if you came home, we could talk to your grandpa and figure things out. But now that you're staying with him, we're going to move forward without you." It was wild. Like, they didn't even care about mending the relationship. They straight up said they were done because they didn't need Grandpa's money anymore. Apparently, my mom's brother, who I barely even know, decided to step in and help them out with their business. So now they didn't need me or Grandpa's support. I read that text about 5 times just to make sure I wasn't missing something. But nope, that was it. They were basically like, "Okay, we're done with you. Don't bother coming back." And you know what? I was fine with it. More than fine, actually. If they thought cutting ties was going to hurt me, they were dead wrong. I'd already made peace with the fact that they never really cared about me, so this was just them confirming what I already knew. But then, because my family can never just leave things alone, my mom texted me later that day with a whole new level of crazy. She started off by trying to guilt trip me, saying things like, "We did everything for you. We raised you, fed you, put a roof over your head, and this is how you repay us?" You know, typical parent stuff where they act like doing the bare minimum for your child is some huge favor that you should be eternally grateful for. She even tried to spin it like I was the one abandoning them, like I was being ungrateful for everything they'd done. She didn't mention all the years of treating me like I didn't matter, or how they always put my sister first. Nope, none of that. It was all about how I was the bad guy for not coming home and fixing things. Then she said something that really ticked me off. She called me violent and disrespectful because I slapped my sister during that fight. Now, let me be clear. My sister was the one who jumped me in the street. She tackled me, pushed me to the ground, and only stopped because my friend pulled her off. But of course, my mom conveniently ignored that part and made it sound like I just walked up and slapped her for no reason. It was classic manipulation, twisting the story to make me look like the villain. At first, I wanted to respond. I wanted to tell her everything, lay out exactly how they'd treated me, how they'd never cared about me unless it benefited them. But then I realized, what was the point? They'd never listen. Even if I told them the truth, they'd just twist it again to fit their narrative. So instead of getting sucked back into their drama, I did the smartest thing I'd done in years. I blocked them. Yep, I went ahead and blocked my mom, my dad, and my sister on everything. Phone, social media, you name it, they were gone. And just like that, I felt free, like truly free for the first time in my life. I didn't have to worry about their constant texts or guilt trips or manipulations. They couldn't reach me, and I wasn't going to waste any more time trying to reach them. Living with Grandpa was going great, by the way. He didn't push me to talk about anything unless I wanted to. He gave me space when I needed it, but he was always there when I wanted to chat. And slowly, I started feeling like I could actually build a life without my parents' crap hanging over me. School was going fine too. I had a solid group of friends, and yeah, my football player friend and I started dating. Some of you called it in the comments, and you were right. It just kind of happened naturally after everything, and he's been amazing. He's the first person who's ever made me feel truly supported, like I'm worth something. But the biggest change? I got into the college I wanted. Yep, I'm heading off in the fall, and my grandpa's paying for everything, just like he promised. I honestly can't believe how much my life has changed in just a few months. I went from feeling trapped and invisible in my own family to finally being able to live for myself. As for my parents, I haven't heard a word from them since I blocked them, and I hope it stays that way. They made their choice, and I made mine. I'm not going to waste any more time trying to fix something that was broken from the start. Grandpa and I are closer than ever now. He's the only family I really need. We've even talked about taking a trip together before I go off to college, just the two of us. It feels good to have someone in my corner for once, someone who actually gives a damn about me. So yeah, I guess this is the happy ending I never thought I'd get. It's not perfect, and I know there'll be more bumps along the way, but for the first time in a long time, I'm looking forward to the future. Thanks for sticking with me through all this. I'm done with that part of my life, and I'm ready to move on. And honestly, it feels pretty damn good.